He was the Terminator. He had no fear. I think he was the quickest driver on the track at that time. He didn't improve in the areas he was slow. He just went even quicker in the areas where he was good. We had microwaves for heating tyres, and I don't see that ever changing, to be honest. To be honest, initially, Lewis was quicker. He was, straight away, incredibly precise. Fernando might have benefited from a bit more communication. He wasn't quite ready to make that step. Always be faster or better. Fernando did a spectacular job. To be honest, the company was on its way out. It was meant to manipulate the championship, but there you go. That's what happens.
This is the DRS train.
Welcome to the DRS Train podcast. I'm Ciaron Smith, F1, and today we have an incredibly special guest joining Peter Brook, Nav F1, Nedzo, and myself, of course, the great Mark Slade, one of the most illustrious race engineers in the history of Formula One. Mark, it is honestly surreal to have you on the podcast. You've engineered so many drivers, so many legends of the sport. It's really important for the viewers, I think, to understand how many teams and drivers you've worked with as a part of your illustrious career. So I'm going to list some of them. Martin Brundle, Mika Häkkinen, Kimi Räikkönen, Fernando Alonso, Heikki Kovalainen, Vitaly Petrov, Michael Schumacher, Pastor Maldonado, Esteban Ocon, Nico Hülkenberg, Kevin Magnussen, and even Ollie Behrman. And really your career spanned from the V10 to the hybrid V6s. So thanks so much for taking the time.
Oh, thank you very much. You're too kind, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And why don't we kick it off by really thinking about how does one become Mark Slade? Apart from the natural biological processes, did you always want to be a race engineer? Or did you just stumble into McLaren one day in the 90s? How did that come about, Mark?
No, it was very much something I wanted to do from a pretty young age. I think I remember being aware, sort of occasionally watching racing in the early 70s when I was very small. And unfortunately, one of my earliest memories is actually Joe Siffert's crash at Brands Hatch, which was shown live on television at the time. And I must have been 4 or 5 years old, but I still have that image in my mind. But then obviously the exploits of Jackie Stewart and Emerson Fittipaldi in the early 70s. And then I think probably the thing that changed it the most was James Hunt's championship in 76, the drama that went along with that. And that was probably one of my sort of earliest memories as sort of becoming more seriously involved. And then I think my mum bought me a copy of Autosport for some long journey that I was doing when I was a kid. This would have been in 77. And, I didn't know that magazines covering Formula One and motorsport in general existed. So I opened it, and it would just opened up a whole new world. And then really I became a serious fan of Formula One around about 79, 80. And I was a massive fan of Alan Jones and the Williams team in that period. Just kind of like their style, the fact that they were a new team breaking ground, and it was the era of ground effects, and that was just really a fascinating time, and the technological advances that were going on around that time. It just seemed like a really interesting thing. So I kind of decided around about the age of 12, 13 that if I could get involved in Formula One as some sort of engineer, then that's what I wanted to do. So I sort of chose my subjects at school on the basis of wanting to be an engineer, and got good enough grades, went to Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh to do mechanical engineering. And then, I sort of decided to try and write to all the teams to get a job. But as was the case at that time, I'm sure it still is, unless you had experience, they weren't really that interested. But there's a company called Reynard Racing Cars who made Formula Ford, Formula Vauxhall Lotus, Formula 3, Formula 3000 cars. And they had a thing called a Reynard Scholarship, where they basically took a number of graduates on each year for a very small amount of money, and you could get a foot in the door to go and work for them. I mean, it was great for them because they could employ graduates for next to no money. But at the same time, I realized that the most important thing, if I wanted to do this, was to get a foot in the door. And so the fact they were paying very little money was inconsequential. It was just an opportunity to get involved in something. So I was lucky enough to be interviewed by Adrian Reynard and to be offered the opportunity of the job, which was fantastic. And so in July of 1989, the day after the British Grand Prix, which I came down to watch, it was my first time at a Formula One race or a Formula One Grand Prix race. I walked in the doors of Reynard Racing Cars and got a job in the drawing office. And initially just drawing brackets and basic items. I mean, there were only about 7 people in the drawing office. There were, I think, 4 or 5 people started at the same time as me. So let's say there were 10 or 11 people, 5 or 6 permanent staff plus the graduates. And the big turning point really came when about 3 or 4 people who were in the drawing office at Reynard's left to form the basis of the Jordan design office. And that meant that Reynard suddenly had a need for people to fill more, shall we say, responsible jobs, because they just didn't have enough people. So unbelievably, myself and another chap called David Brown were given responsibility for the following year's Formula 3 car, which was just fantastic opportunity. So we undertook the sort of basic, a lot of the parts were already designed in terms of they came from the parts catalogue, and Malcolm Osler, who was in charge of the drawing office, kind of gave the basic design guidance, but we were also given an incredible amount of freedom to pursue that. And so that was a great opportunity. In a silly incident, in early 1991 meant that I actually got sacked from that job. And I applied for other jobs again. Again, still Formula One teams were somewhat reluctant, but I got a job working with Ron Toronak at Rolt, again on Formula 3 cars. That was at a time when Rolt had just been bought by March Engineering, and to be honest, the company was on its way out. But fortunately, McLaren were looking for people, and my application from something like 6 months previously must have caught the eye of someone, because I was invited to a series of interviews with McLaren. And I joined McLaren in late September 1991. So to work in the drawing office. I was initially just a design draftsman, design engineer, working on relatively smaller parts. I was a support for Tim Goss, who was in charge of engine installation and ancillaries, and so I kind of became his design assistant, and it went from there really. So I was just, obviously had a certain amount of aptitude and determination and practical approach to how to get involved in the business, but also a lot of circumstances involved in that.
That's incredible. Just quick follow on to that. Tim Goss, of course, was he designed some of those McLaren cars in the 2000s, didn't he? I mean, I think he took over go ahead. Sorry.
He became one of the chief engineers around that time, and he was responsible for, I think, the 2008 car that Lewis won the championship in. But it was a bit of an unusual setup at McLaren at that time, in that there was a group of chief engineers covering different areas. But Tim and Pat Fry kind of alternated being in charge of the car from one year to another. So Pat was responsible for the 2007 and had been responsible for 2005, I think, and Tim 2006, 2008. But there were also a lot of other people involved. There was no clear design lead after Adrian's departure at the end of 2005. So that's Adrian Newey, obviously. So it was an interesting time, but yeah, it was good.
Amazing. Yeah, we'll get to that for sure. I guess before Peter jumps in about technology and such, what were you doing at McLaren in those first 3 years before you got that race engineer job? I think you just sort of answered that, but I guess another follow-on question would be: did you have any contact with Senna or Mika at that early stage?
So probably the area I did the most work in, or two areas, were the hydraulics on the car and the fuel system on the car. So I was basically drawing pipes and fittings and radiators and parts of the fuel tank, making sure the fuel pumps were in the right area. I remember Ayrton coming into the factory certainly when he won the championship in '91. He came in and there was like a team gathering, and we had our photographs taken as design groups with him, which was just amazing, given that 3 years earlier I'd just been a fan watching these guys on television. I remember him walking through the drawing office, and there was a certain hush that descended when he walked through. You realised that you were in his presence, shall we say. But I never spoke to him on an individual basis. And the reason I got the job on the race team for '94 was because that was when refueling was introduced. And Dave Ryan, the team manager, wanted someone with some understanding of the fuel system in the car to be on board to sort of help with integrating the equipment that was required into the race team. And also the chap who had been the assistant engineer had expressed that he didn't want to do the travelling anymore. So there was kind of a double opportunity available. So that was I'd spoken with Neil Oatley, was the chief engineer, and I got on well with him. He had been at Williams when he was Carlos Reutemann's race engineer back in 81, and so I'd plucked up the courage to have a chat to him about things at that time, having been a big Williams fan at that time. And I guess I'd expressed my interest in going travelling and racing, and I guess he must have just thought, well, he seems like a decent sort of person. So I think those were my opportunities. So it was fantastic. But yeah, it was basically down to pipes got me into trackside Formula One.
Amazing.
So obviously that was when your career as a race engineer specifically began, and naturally, over the past 30 years, the technology in Formula One, especially car design, has changed enormously.
Yeah.
So how much has the role of a race engineer changed from 30 years ago to now, would you say?
The bare bones of it haven't changed in as much as it's still about organising the fuel, the tyres, the springs and bars that get fitted to the car, telling the mechanics what the setup of the car should be, talking to the driver about what he's happy with, what he isn't happy with. All those things are basically unchanged, but what has changed dramatically is the complexity of the cars and the sort of detail of how far into the detail the teams now go with tyres, with performance analysis, with the sensors on the car and the use of data, and obviously development of simulators and modelling. That's come on enormously. And what that means meant for me was that I actually gradually started to have less and less say in what actually was done with the car, because you became more of a conduit for information from other departments and other people. So to be honest, my direct input into the outcome was kind of reduced in terms of my own knowledge and application of knowledge, shall we say.
Would you say as well that the drivers themselves have more input on the race engineering side on the basis that the steering wheels are so much more complicated now, that they can change so many settings on the fly and everything else that they couldn't do 30 years ago, maybe?
That aspect hasn't really changed that much since the early 2000s. If you remember, in the early 2000s, we had traction control and we had automatic gearboxes or semi-automatic gearboxes. So in that respect, I would say that that hasn't changed that much. Certainly compared to the early mid-90s, yes, but that sort of technology developed fairly quickly, and then became limited by the FIA. So it's more the fact that the FIA limited what could be done that restricted that. Obviously, they've got to have a certain understanding of battery power and the use of the electrical energy. But no, I wouldn't say it's changed that much. I would say what's changed more is probably the drivers need to understand the tyre management in races. That has become a bigger factor over time than it was. The tyres that were used in the sort of, with Michelin, Goodyear originally, Michelin Bridgestone, I would say were more durable generally. And so tyre management was less of a requirement for the drivers to understand. They still understood it to an extent, and the better drivers did a better job of it. But in those days, the tyres could generally be pushed pretty hard without requiring high levels of management like we see today. But the driver's input has always been crucial. It hasn't. I know sometimes people say, "Oh, the driver's unimportant. It's all about the car and the team these days," but it's completely untrue. And when you see the difference between, say, a Max Verstappen and a Yuki Tsunoda, or all the other teammates that Max has had, you see how the driver is absolutely crucial to pulling it all together and making the most of it. And I don't see that ever changing, to be honest.
Yeah, that's amazing to think about. And you bring up a good point there about how a great driver can absolutely still make the difference, and always has.
Yeah.
So speaking of great drivers, and we'll detour back into the engineering component, but speaking of great drivers, you worked with many of them, and one of them was Mika Häkkinen, obviously, and you won 2 drivers' titles with him. I believe 1 constructor's title as well.
Yeah.
And from the outside, I was a big Mika fan initially. That's how I got into the sport. And I got into the sport because Michael turned into Jacques at that race in Jerez. But then I started watching, and Mika was my favorite. And I felt he was very calm, but very intelligent. How was he like to work with? How did he communicate feedback? And, any kind of commentary on his driving style? One thing about Mika was, like, you would see him take these lines where he put the tire on the grass, or you'd think he was about to spin, but he never did. So it'd just be interesting to hear your take on his feedback and his personality and his driving style.
Yeah, he was a very pleasant guy to work with. He was quite a jolly character, quite humorous, in a shall we say a basic sort of way, as in he once told me that his favorite comedian was Benny Hill. I don't know if that's someone you've come across, but he was a slapstick comedian of the sort of 70s and 80s, which Mika found quite amusing for some reason. But yeah, it was a pretty basic sense of humor in that sense. But he was a pretty happy-go-lucky sort of guy. I think his accident in Adelaide in '95 did have a bit of an impact on his personality, and made him maybe a bit less happy-go-lucky than he had been before that. I know when he was in Formula 3, apparently he used to ride around the paddock on a motorcycle, because he went to circus school when he was a kid. So he learned acrobatics and sort of physical gymnastic sort of tricks. And I think that in many ways was a big influence on his his driving. He was supremely natural when it came to feeling the car and its balance and being able to react to it. So I think he was very much a physical driver, and his inputs were very precise, and he had incredible hand-eye coordination. And I think that's where a lot of his innate speed came from. He just had tremendous feel for the car. In terms of the technical side, he knew what he wanted from the car in terms of where the balance was good or bad. And when we used to sit down and do sort of circuit maps with him, we would simply do the standard, entry, mid, exit, understeer, oversteer, 1 to 5. And it was funny that his comments in the car didn't always tally with the maps that he did. So sometimes his commentary during the sessions was maybe a little bit erratic, because he was trying to understand what was going on a moment by moment basis. But when he sat down and he had a bit of time to think, he would actually sit down and he'd be quiet for a few moments, and then he would start to do the map with you. And that's when it became clear what the issues were. And even if he'd been complaining mostly of understeer through a session, once you broke down the circuit with him, and you'd say, well, actually, look, a lot of these entries are actually on the edge. And he'd be like, yeah, you're right. It's actually, the car's too sharp on the entries. And that's when you'd make progress. So, yeah, he was just very natural. And when Adrian became part of the team, it just lit a fire in him. He got on brilliantly with Adrian. Adrian has a really good relationship with drivers. Adrian's done some driving himself, and he just has an innate understanding of what drivers need, and he can talk their language. And that really enthused Mika, and Mika would basically, he understood that Adrian was very smart. And Adrian, at the time, when I first started race engineering, I was actually performance engineer 94 to 97, but I became race engineer in 98, which was Adrian's first year on the team. And it used to be me, Adrian, and Mika, and a chap called Phil Prue was the performance engineer. And we worked together as a small little team. And Mika he had complete faith in what Adrian had to say. And so we would do the things that Adrian wanted to the car a lot of the time. And sometimes they actually involved multiple simultaneous changes, which is something that as a race engineer, you don't normally do because it can be confusing. But Adrian's grasp of what was going on, combined with Mika's natural flair for driving, really, it came together. And it was just amazing. It was an amazing process to be part of. We had the car, I remember in Monaco in 98, we had the car in pieces between practice and qualifying. And Adrian decided we should make numerous changes to the car in weight distribution, mechanical balance. And it was amazing because most drivers would be worried about that going into a session with a car that they didn't understand. But Mika just took to it like a duck to water, and he just drove that new car even faster than he already had, because he was completely confident in what Adrian wanted, what Adrian thought was right, and the fact that it fitted Mika's driving style. And the other thing with Mika is he used to get bored with the car. If the car setup stayed the same through a weekend, he'd actually get bored with it. And he wanted change. He's the only driver I've ever worked with who actually reacted positively to the car feeling different, even if what the car was not necessarily better than the previous car. He just liked change. And he would go faster because he was no longer bored. So it was absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. A unique character.
What an incredible talent. And you know what's incredible to hear there, Mark, is that first of all, that Monaco 98 weekend, he was imperious, wasn't he? I mean, that lap he did in qualifying, that has to be one of the greatest laps ever.
It was, but actually his qualifying laps in 94 and 99 were better in that I don't know if you remember, he qualified second in '94 in the McLaren Peugeot, which was not a good car, but he drove that car like I don't know how. He was bouncing off the barriers. He was using the barriers to turn the car into corners. He was on fire. It was just unbelievable. And in '99, we were consistently 3 or 4 tenths off Michael. And then he just sort of sat in the car in '99, thought about it for a little while, went out and just blitzed it and put it on pole. And it was astonishing. I mean, we had just no idea that it was possible with the car he had. So he could do things. And this all comes down to that natural feel for the car and his knowing how to balance all the inputs in a way that I don't think anyone else could have done at that time. I think he was the quickest driver on the track at that time. And I think Michael recognised that, to be honest, as well. Wasn't necessarily the best driver overall in terms of the understanding of the car, the commitment, everything. But I think on his day, when everything was going well for him, I think he was just in another league.
That is just incredible to hear. And I remember that '99 session. First of all, I remember him just flying through the final sector, but he put his hand up, didn't he? When the I think there was yellow flags on the track, and Mika put his hand out to say, "Hey, I've seen them." Yeah. And he would just be flooring it through to that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How on earth did you see that? You didn't see that at all, did he?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was unbelievable, Mark. Honestly, it's so nice to hear you talk about that.
It was amazing.
I think one quick thing then I want to touch on before I hand it off here to someone else is his driving style compared to DC quickly. DC has said in the past that, the 98 car maybe didn't suit him as well. And, how did that affect how you ran 2 setups inside a garage? And specifically, do you think that if a team does have 2 different driving styles, that can hurt development? I'm thinking of maybe 98 or 2005, which we'll get to. Any thoughts? Thoughts on that?
I actually don't think that the differences between DC and Mika were massive. I think it's just that Mika was happier with a car that was a little bit livelier at the rear to allow it to be faster on turn-in. And DC needed a more stable platform. DC was last of the late breakers, and he was phenomenally good at hard, deep braking into a corner. And at circuits like Imola and Montreal, DC was actually quicker. He had a better handle on that sort of Nate type of circuit. And Monza was another one as well, where DC actually was generally a bit quicker than Mika. I remember a test there we did with Mika, and he was consistently 3 or 4 tenths off DC's pace, and it was at the first chicane and the second chicane, and I think a little bit of Ascari, and he just couldn't brake late and hard, get the car stopped and get it round the corner without generating too much understeer, which DC was able to avoid. And I remember we came down to like the last afternoon, the last hour, and we just hadn't got on top of it. We'd been getting Mika out of the car, showing him the overlays, trying to get him to drive quicker. And with the last run, he went out and he blitzed the lap. He was, for the first time, he went faster than DC. And we looked at the overlay, and he was still slower in all the places that DC was faster. The chicanes. He just went quicker everywhere else. So he was quicker through the Lesmos, quicker through Parabolica by an enormous amount, such that his overall lap time went from being 3 tenths slower to 2 tenths faster. But it wasn't the areas where he didn't improve in the areas he was slow. He just went even quicker in the areas where he was good. It was so frustrating. But at the same time, it was just Mika. That was just the way he was. They did require different setups, and they had a very different approach to setting the car up. DC kind of had to build his confidence through practice up to qualifying, whereas Mika was kind of on it in his unique way from the start. But if problems arose during the practice sessions, Mika wasn't always necessarily able to adapt to that. If he'd been going well and then the circumstances of the weekend changed such that the wind direction changed or track temperature change and it caused an imbalance in the car, he might become reluctant to adjust the car to deal with that, because he was hanging on to the fact that it had been good before. So that could sometimes be a little bit of a weakness. And he wasn't the best at making decisions ultimately. Like gear ratio choices would take forever because he'd want the ratios to be perfect at 3 different corners where we couldn't, because they were the same ratio and the corners were different speeds. And so you'd say, well, I can make it better here, but then it's going to be worse there. So which one do you want? And he just couldn't accept that you'd have to make a compromise. So that meant we had some very late ratio choices, which the guys didn't like. And he would still be unhappy afterwards that, oh yeah, but here it's still, the gap's too big. And I was like, I'm sorry, we can't do that without making the other one worse. So you have to decide which of those two is the one that's the bigger problem. So little things like that. But yeah, I mean, he was magic to work with. Just so brilliant, so enthusiastic. But DC was brilliant as well. I think DC underestimates himself a little bit. DC was a very, very good driver. And he was a little bit unfortunate in coming up against Mika at his best. But I think DC was capable. DC was very unfortunate with some engine and general reliability issues that we had in '98. I think DC had 3 engine failures that year, and Mika didn't have any. And those things could have swung things round. So yeah, some of it was circumstances as much as anything.
That sounds quite in depth and entertaining. So one question I have is, obviously Mika and DC for a long while in the record books had the record for the longest run as teammates. For 5 years straight they were teammates. Does continuity, having 2 drivers who know each other well, who have similar-ish styles, work better than having chopping and changing, or does it create stagnation, or does it help you find other perspectives?
I suppose it's a bit of all those things, to be honest. But it was a pretty happy team in terms of the 2 drivers. They did get on with each other, and because over time we understood the differences between their sort of requirements, that meant that we could filter out what wasn't relevant and what was relevant between their driving, and that made for a good environment. So it was great to have them. And when Kimi came along to replace Mika after Mika decided he didn't want to carry on, the dynamics did change a bit. But to be fair, this is one of DC's strengths, that he was just an honest, good guy, and he never. I know there were some things that happened that he wasn't happy about, such as team orders and such like. But he still just got on with it and dealt with it, and didn't complain significantly of them. When he thought things were maybe a little bit unfair, but he was normally very reasonable about it, and he was very approachable. So it was just a pleasant environment. And yeah, Kimi didn't have as much to do with DC as Mika had. They didn't have the same relationship, but it wasn't really any sort of a problem. It was a good environment. It did change a bit when Montoya came on in place of DC. That was where relations changed a bit. But to be honest, it was more. There were more other issues within the team and the way the team was working than between the drivers. In the case of Mika and David, and David and Kimi. So I've got a lot of time for David. I think he was a fantastic driver, and I think he's better, as I said already, than even he necessarily would allow. I think he had world championship potential, definitely.
Absolutely, and I think we all feel that way too. Funnily enough, he was a consummate professional, and I mean, the way we look at it is, if Mika and Michael were the best, DC was right behind them. If Michael, Kimi, and Fernando were the best, the DC was right behind them, even in the early part of the century. So yeah, he was mega, and I think he was really good wheel to wheel. I just remember so many great duels with him. He had with with drivers. I think, you mentioned Kimi came into the team, incredible rise through the ranks. We've rarely ever seen a driver come. In fact, we've never seen a driver come through F1 with such little experience, and then join McLaren, fight for the title in his second year. He was like a meteor. It was just so explosively quick and frankly thrilling to watch that bloke. It felt like he was just on the edge every lap at times, but he's become almost like a myth, the legend, his driving, his character. What was it actually like to engineer him? We've heard that his feedback became incredible, and he was also, with the greatest respect, because he was also my favorite driver, he could be intimidating almost to work around because he was so direct and straight to the point. Would love to hear your thoughts on the driver and those points as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most amazing thing about him was that his feedback was unbelievably good from day one. There wasn't a build-up. He was straight away incredibly precise in terms of understanding what he needed and what was going on with the car. I mean, he could pinpoint things instantly. And on top of that, he was able to make use of the tools on the car. So playing with things like the differential, the traction control that we had at that time. He had no fear about making adjustments and understanding. He could feel what they did positively and negatively. And he would simply come back and tell you, without being asked, he would say, oh, by the way, I changed the diff locking to this and it was better here because of this, but worse here and here because of that. And at that time, we could map things around the track. So that precision of information would allow us to adjust the car on a distance basis to get the better performance out of him. And also, I don't know if you remember, but I think it was 2003, we had an adjustable front wing as well. So that meant that he could adjust the balance whilst he was driving. And that meant that we actually were spending more of the time adjusting the car with things like engine braking, brake balance, him adjusting the front wing, the differential controls, and actually the mechanical side of the car kind of started to take a bit of a back seat. Once you'd got a good basis, you could adjust those other elements and have more of an impact on the car's performance than constantly fiddling around with things like stiffness and mechanical balance. So that was fabulous. And his ability to feel what the traction control was doing was phenomenal. The McLaren had a really good traction control system, which it wasn't as tightly controlled as some of the other teams ran. So a lot of teams took a very theoretical approach to traction control slip targets, which actually I think was a problem because, frankly, everybody's understanding of what target was required was actually a bit crude and basic, and so they were actually constraining themselves a little bit, whereas the McLaren system gave the drivers a little bit of margin to overslip to their advantage if they chose, so they could actually play around with the amount of slip they had around about a margin. And I think that our drivers were able to use that with good effect. And I think I've told this story in public before, but one of the things that demonstrated Kimi's incredible feel and ability to pinpoint things was Tag Electronics, who did the electronics for McLaren at the time. They revised our traction control software in the latter part of 2002. So after the season finished, in winter testing, we were running with DC and I think trying to remember who would have been test driver at the time. I think it might have been Pedro de la Rosa or Alex Wirtz. But we'd done a number of pre-Christmas tests with this new software, and it had all apparently gone very well. No problems arose. Kimi, being Kimi, had done the last race in 2002 and then gone off on some sort of, shall we say, holiday. with some of the mechanics for a period of time in Finland. And he didn't drive the car until we did a test in Jerez in January of 2003. And he got in the car and he did the installation lap, and he came back and he said, "There's something wrong with the traction control. It's not. It's the target. It's not. It's tight. It's coming in too early, and we need to adjust it because I don't like the way it's coming in before I want it to." So we were a bit confused, and we thought, well, we don't think that's true. So we kind of resisted what he said initially, and we said, well, why don't it's only done an installation lap. Why don't you put the set of tires on, go out and do 5 laps, and then come back and let us know how it is, because it's quite cold and might not be up to it. He was like, well, okay, I can do that, he said. So he got in the car and he did his 5 laps and he got out of the car, and I said, so how is it? He said, well, like I told you before, the traction control's cutting in too early and we need to do something about it. I was like, okay. So we made an adjustment. I think we increased the slip target by about 1%, and he went out and he drove it and he came back and he said, yeah, that's okay now. That's fine. That's back to where it should be. And we were like, oh, okay. And we didn't think much more of it. And so for the rest of the year, every time we went to a new track, we'd adjust the target to be a percentage different to what we'd run the year before. Anyway, about 2/3 of the way through the season, someone from Tag Electronics came over and said, yeah, we found a little bit of a problem in the software, in the coding, and there's a loop that it should have been doing that it got missed out. And the effect of that would have been to drop the target by about 1%. So we've now switched that on. So you'll need to change all your targets back to what you ran last year. And we did, and they were right. And that was it. Yeah, so
that's beyond
unbelievable feel for the car, had just picked that up on an installation lap, and the other drivers hadn't noticed. So that was typical. And the point of that exercise was really, or what that showed me, was that when Kimi said there was something not quite right with the car, you'd really have to look in immense detail at what was going on before you could say, I don't think that's right. Because a lot of the time he was right. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. So yeah, he was just amazing. And he didn't talk an awful lot, as people know. He didn't say a lot about things. He was incredibly precise. So what he did say was worth listening to. You mentioned that he was a little bit intimidating. I never found that at all. He was incredibly generous. I mean, if we made mistakes, and let's face it, people do make mistakes, he never blamed us. He was never unhappy. He would just shrug his shoulders and go, well, he knew that we were trying our hardest, as he was most of the time. And he just accepted it as one of those things. He wouldn't be happy about things that got changed, when politics came into it, or people tried to make changes to the car that he didn't agree with, or we were going in directions that he didn't agree with. He'd be he wouldn't be happy about that. But he wasn't, I wouldn't say he was an intimidating person to work with at all. Maybe, I think maybe some of the marketing media people had a different experience, because certainly that side of things wasn't something he enjoyed, and he was pretty clear about that. Although, to be fair, again, I think once he was doing things, he was fine. But he was just him. There was no difference between the person at the car that you dealt with or the person outside. He was just very honest and straightforward, and I found him an absolute pleasure to deal with. And he had a good sense of humor as well. We used to have a laugh, and he used to ask me about my kids and how we were doing, and I really enjoyed him to work with. And when he came back to Lotus, back in 2012, it was great to be reacquainted with him. It was just a really good experience.
Well, that's great to hear, Mark. Thank you, Karen. That's great to hear, Mark. And I still am actually a big Alonso fan. And just after Kimi, you got to work with Alonso. So
yeah,
we'll have some more questions on Kimi just after this. But you said that you actually liked working with Kimi. You said that he's not as intimidating as sometimes the media has painted him as. But how did you adapt to then working with Fernando, who, according to the media, according to what we've heard, was a bit different? to Mika and Kimi and how brief they were? Was Fernando more of a... Was he more talkative? Did he look for something that was very different to the two Finnish drivers?
He actually wasn't a lot more talkative, to be honest. Although I think one of the things that maybe could have been better in our relationship was that because I'd worked with Mika and Kimi, and they were two drivers who didn't want a lot of talk on the radio in particular. I think maybe we didn't appreciate that Fernando might have benefited from a bit more communication when he was in the car. But he didn't really ask for that. But there were a couple of times when he sort of, I think one time he did say on the radio, "I feel lonely" or something. and I guess that was he didn't feel that we were necessarily supporting him. I think the one thing I would say was that actually Fernando would have benefited from a feeling of better support from the team. And I guess that was part of the fundamental problem that affected him in his year with McLaren. But on a personal basis, I really enjoyed working with Fernando. He was different in terms of he did want a different setup from the car. He said basically, I don't want oversteer. He said, whatever you do, I don't want oversteer. But as long as the car was benign, he would drive the car as he wanted to drive it. So for instance, like throttle maps, he said at the start of the year, just give me a throttle map. We'll make a couple of changes on the first day of the first test. But once I'm happy with it, don't ever change it. Just leave it alone. And that was great. So he was pretty straightforward to work with. The only thing that could be slightly difficult was if you were doing a test, particularly if you changed something at a race weekend. He realised that obviously Lewis was looking at his information, the other side of the garage was looking at his information, so he wouldn't always give you a completely straight answer as to whether something you changed was better or not. So you do a change, the lap time wouldn't necessarily be clearly different. I'd ask him, what's the difference? And he'd be like, yeah, it hasn't made a big difference, but we'll go back to the other one. Or yeah, we'll stick with this one. And I had to sort of guess that yes, it was a bit better, or there was something better about it, but he wouldn't necessarily let on. But I think that was partly a function of the circumstances that he found himself in. Yeah, so I personally didn't really find him a problem in terms of he is a different character. He wants. We were talking about football. I'm not a big football fan, but Pedro and Fernando supported different teams. So Fernando was a Real Madrid's fan, and Pedro was a Barcelona fan. And I thought it was interesting that Fernando once said, the only thing that matters is that Barcelona lose. It doesn't matter if Madrid win as long as Barcelona lose. And I thought, that's maybe a little bit reflective of a certain approach to things. But his determination was unparalleled. I mean, he was the Terminator in the car. When we did simulator sessions, something that he did do that Kimi wasn't a fan of, but you'd put him in the car, he would do a run, then you'd make a change to the simulator setup and you do another run, and you might say, well, let's do 5 laps. But come the fifth lap, you'd say, and he hadn't improved his lap time in the simulator, you'd say, okay, shall we stop now? And he'd be like, no, just give me a few more laps. And he would just keep going. He would keep going until he drove faster, a better lap time. And then he'd stop. And if he made a mistake while he was in the simulator, you'd hear him go, and he'd be unhappy with himself or something. And he just was so determined to always be faster or better. It was quite that aspect of it was quite something, and not something I'd really encountered before. So yeah, a real phenomenon. And I know he, at the time, 2005, 2006, he was back-to-back world champion, and it was amazing to work with someone who was that. But obviously, he hasn't won another championship since then. So I think people forget just how good he was, and the fact that he's still competing at the age he is now, in some ways it doesn't surprise me because it is his absolute determination that drives him. It's impressive. I really like the guy. He's a very likable person on a one-to-one basis with people he trusts. He's great to be with, but I think he keeps himself to himself and his people close to him, and he expects trust from people, and I think that was the thing that he didn't get at McLaren. He didn't feel that, and I think that was probably somewhat understandable. Things didn't go as maybe they should have done. He's a proud guy. He's a very proud character. So yeah, but I really liked him. I enjoyed working with Fernando. I didn't necessarily enjoy the way the atmosphere was within the team the whole year because it became quite difficult. But I don't think that was Fernando's fault, other than it was something of a misunderstanding of his nature and character, and I don't think he was managed as well as he could have been.
That's fascinating to hear. Two small follow-up questions. Firstly, he's now quite known for his radio messages, for being quite funny on his radio messages with his engineer, trying to even get some things out of the broadcasts. Was it something you said that sometime once he said that he was lonely? Is it something that sometimes he would say, like, be quite, let's say, entertaining on radio during the race? And then secondly, he was the first driver who you had to engineer as a world champion. Obviously, Mika, you were working with the team. How was it for you to be just told Fernando Alonso is the driver you are going to be working with? Was it something that made you feel some pressure or more some excitement?
So going back to the radio thing, there wasn't an awful lot of talk on the radio at that time. And I don't actually remember him making many comments like that. I think that's something that came along later when he realised that, because the radio wasn't broadcast very much in those days, and I think he's latterly just taking advantage of the fact that he knows that some of it gets broadcast, and so he's using it a little bit more to make his points. I think his nature was similar. I think that there were certainly times in discussions after sessions when he'd make sort of funny comments about things and what have you. So, and that was how you knew what he was thinking. The other thing he told me was that he said he used to play with the journalists in the interviews, and he'd sometimes say, sometimes I say actually the opposite of what I think, just to see what reaction I get from the journalists, just to basically to wind them up. And he said it's really funny when you say something that's the opposite of what they expect, and just to see their responses to it. So he would do that, and to him it was a little bit of a game, and maybe a little bit naive. I think he genuinely just didn't really care what people thought, but that can be a problem. On the rest of it, when he was coming to the team, I was excited about the fact to work with him. I was very sad that Kimi had gone, but I was very excited to be working with the two-time world champion, and a little bit interested to know what he would want. I mean, obviously, you don't know how well you're going to get on with someone. As it happens, I think I got on with him pretty well, so that was great. I remember basically myself and Phil Prue, who was the other race engineer, were called into Martin Whitmarsh's office, and basically we were asked, did either of us have a preference to work with Lewis or Fernando, and or basically would anybody like to work with Lewis rather than with Fernando? And we both said we'd like to work with Fernando. So Martin said, okay, understood. In that case, I'll make the decision. And latterly I heard that he decided that I'd work with Fernando, and I was very pleased with that, to be honest. Working with the best drivers has always been a pleasure, because what could be better than working with someone at the top of their game? It's just fantastic and a privilege to be given that sort of opportunity. So, and the other thing I would say is the best drivers, I've never had a problem. I've always found them to be good people in terms of professional, committed. You can't want for more than the top guys. They are brilliant people to work with.
Peter, before you jump in, I wanted to ask a quick question, and that would be quickly, Mark. I mean, we want to move on to the next section, but could you quickly point out maybe the moment you realized Kimi was special? And I remember that Nürburgring 2003 weekend, for example, the moment you knew Fernando was special when you were engineering him. And the final quick question is, if McLaren had raced in Indy 2005, do you think McLaren would have won? I've always said Kimi would have dominated that race, but that's just my view. Over to you on that.
Well, just your last point first. The tyre would have failed. It's as simple as that. The tyres would have failed. So he would not have won the race because the tyres would have failed. Without that problem, I have no doubt he'd have won the race because he would have been on pole position because Trulli, who was on pole, was only on pole because they put one lap of fuel in his car. Kimi was the quickest driver that weekend. And if the car had let him, he'd have won that race quite comfortably. He was phenomenal around Indianapolis. We'd seen that in the previous years with him. In 2004, we had a car that was running on 9 cylinders. we lost a cylinder in the race, and he actually got to the point where he was setting quicker lap times with the car not running properly. And in the wet race in 2003, I think it was, the Michelin wets were not as good as the Bridgestones at that time. And he finished second in the race, and he just drove unbelievably well. He made all the right calls as to when to change tyres, because I think we switched, I can't remember precisely, but certainly we were switching between types of tyres during that race, and his timing on that was spectacularly good. So yeah, there's no doubt he'd have won that race in the right circumstances, but the circumstances weren't right, and he had to stop. The tyres would have failed. There is no question about that. The big problem was that we didn't know he was not going to take part in the race. He had an argument with Ron Dennis on the grid when Ron said, you really must not race. And he was quite adamant that he wanted to race. And when he set off at the start of the formation lap, we did not know whether he was going to pull in or not. But we were relieved when he did, because honestly, he could have had an almighty accident, or he would have had if he'd started the race. It's as simple as that. So yeah, but he was very unhappy about that situation because he knew he'd lost an opportunity to win a race. So I think I've forgotten the rest of your questions.
Just very, very quickly, just one moment from Kimi and Fernando. Yeah. We talked about Mika, but you thought, oh my goodness, Kimi is unbelievable. This Fernando is special. If you could pinpoint one for each.
With Kimi, it was immediately apparent at the very first test. I think we were at the what was the name place? Valencia. On the sort of motorbike track rather than the street track that later came along. Just straight away, his pace was phenomenal, and straight away his feedback. It was like working with a driver who'd been driving for 5 or 6 years already. That was what was amazing, was that given that he had done 1 year in the Sauber, and before that he'd done 21 car races or something before that. So he was just quick, and everything you wanted was just there straight away. So we knew going into that season that we were working with someone phenomenally good. And Mark Arnold, who had been Mika Häkkinen's trainer, worked with Kimi, and he'd already said to us, look, this guy is incredible. So, you're going to have a good year, or good few years. With Fernando, well, obviously we knew he was the double world champion, and you can't be the double world champion without being fantastic. We did a couple of tests before where he drove the 2006 car in, I think it was Valencia again. He drove the 2006 car, and I remember him saying, well, the car's brilliant, but the engine's terrible, which it was in 2006. But, it was just a one-car test. There was no one else there, but he just seemed impressed with the car. So that was good, but as I said, not impressed with the engine. And obviously, I think that gave him some great concerns for 2007, because it was meant to be fundamentally the same engine by the rules. Anyway, in January, he drove the 2007 car for the first time, again without anyone to compete directly against. And he got out the car and said, "I can't believe how much better the engine is. It's just a shame that the car isn't as good as the old one." And that was amazing from the engine point of view, because basically Mercedes had brought in a load of guys from Cosworth who had stopped. When Cosworth stopped doing the V10, they didn't progress beyond that. And so Mercedes had hired a load of their engineers, and they made some incredible changes to the existing engine towards the end of 2006. But we didn't get to try them on track until 2007, and it transformed the performance of that engine. So that was great. But the aero rules had changed slightly for 2007, and the barge boards had to be trimmed. The height of them had been raised, and on the McLaren, that made a tremendous difference to the performance of the airflow, or the airflow going under the floor was tremendously affected by that change, and in a negative way. And we were still trying to learn how to recover that performance. And so he picked up on that straight away, that there was that the performance of the car had actually taken a step back. Then when we went testing with Lewis and Fernando, to be honest, initially Lewis was quicker. And I think Fernando was actually struggling adapting to the Bridgestone tyres, because we'd switched from Michelin to Bridgestone. And I think he found that quite a big problem, because they did require a very different technique. He'd got used to, the Michelins had a very strong front end, and the Renault had a rearward weight distribution. So he had driven a car that was quite sharp. And one of the ways he'd got around that was he used to drive over the peak of the front tyres. He would deliberately apply too much steering lock, such that he went beyond the peak grip of the front tyre, and then he would sort of unwind it back to the point where he got the amount of front grip he wanted. And that's how he killed the tendency for that car to be too sharp. But with the McLaren and on the Bridgestones, he now basically, I don't think he had enough front end generally, and had a car which was a little bit loose at the rear because of the aero changes. And Lewis, having driven Bridgestones in Formula, or GP2, I guess it was at that time, I think the tyres behaved much more similarly to the GP2 tyres that he was used to. And actually, ironically, even though he was the new guy and Fernando was the reigning double world champion, it was actually easier for Lewis to adapt to that car than Fernando. And it was only when we got to Malaysia for the second race of 2007, Fernando really got to grips with the tyres and how to make use of them. And in the race, he was dominant. He just drove away from the field. And at that point, he was so happy. He was so happy with that result, because he realised, I can do this. And we realised what a great driver we had, in that he'd been able to make that adaptation, which was so necessary.
So quickly on the Bridgestones, this is really, really interesting, because Fernando is known for his adapting skills. And you're saying that this was still relatively quickly for him to adapt by the second race. But would you also say that, therefore, it didn't cause much of a difference in the actual season, since he had already adapted to the Bridgestones by the early season? Or because he has often claimed that tyre shift impacted the season a lot.
No, I think it did. He was still learning. I think the circumstances of Malaysia probably gave him other advantages that he was able to make use of. But I think he was still learning about the tyres through the first half of that season. So I have no doubt at all that it affected him. And it made his transition very difficult, because going to the first tests pre-season and finding that his young teammate was inherently quicker, which he acknowledged. He wasn't afraid to acknowledge that to us. He realised that he had a mountain to climb. And as the reigning champion, that was difficult for him to accept. And he realised it gave him a difficult public perception. And at the same time, he had issues within the team that he was having to address that he hadn't expected to have to address. So it definitely made his life more difficult in an unexpected way. And I think it was a testament to his ability that he was able to overcome that, because he'd been driving a Michelin-tired Renault for 4 or 5 years, which did have a very distinct capability. And I think people underestimate how difficult it is for the drivers to adapt when big changes come. It is not an easy thing for them to do. And I think it is definitely an easier thing for a young driver with less preconceptions to come to deal with something new, because it's all part of what he's doing for the first time. But when you get into a groove, it is really hard. So I think Fernando did a spectacular job in getting on top of it as quickly as he did, and dealing with all the other things that you had to deal with that year. And the fact that they finished equal on points at the end of the year is, it's a testament to both of them. Don't get me wrong. I think Lewis was absolutely spectacular that year. He is a phenomenal. He was, and I believe still can be, a phenomenal driver. But so was Fernando. But what Fernando had to deal with was in many ways more difficult, because he was the established guy. So he only had things to lose, whereas for Lewis it was all about positive gain, positive experience, and that was something that Fernando had never had to deal with before, and so it made his life very difficult.
2007, it was just a fascinating season. It was the year that I started watching Formula One as well. But
I like your
yes, thank you. I've had this since I was 16, and it still fits me, which I'm very, very pleased with. Yeah, another fascinating season to actually go back a couple of years was 2003, because I wanted to ask about the specifics of car design, because that was the year that you were planning to run the MP418, which was this really groundbreaking, forward-thinking car, but there were all these problems in testing, which meant it never got raced. So you ran the MP417 again with modifications, but interestingly enough, even though every other team had a brand new car, you were using last year's car, but it was even more competitive than the year before, and Kimi made a push for the title. So what had actually been done to the MP417 that made such a big difference for it?
So although the chassis was the same, in terms of suspension and aero, it was completely updated. We went to what's called split heave and roll rear suspension, so where the heave had no influence on the roll stiffness of the car, and that gave us some tremendous opportunities for changing the way we set the car up. The aero was, a lot of effort had been put into the aero, because the 18 was never going to be available at the start of the season. So the plan was always to start the season with the 17. So work had been done on it. It was just that the 18 was planned to be introduced by, say, race 4 or something, was the original plan, as I recall. So the car had some very good aero characteristics. It was quite a benign car, so that allowed the driver to use it effectively. It was quite a nice car to drive, and Kimi was getting better, and he was very confident with it. So we had a car that, and the engine performance was worked on over the winter as well, and that got better as well. So there were actually quite a lot of things that had been changed, and the car was significantly quicker than the 17 that we'd finished the previous season. The fact that it was as quick as it was kind of a surprise. I don't know what the other teams, maybe they made some mistakes, I don't know, but we had tested very well prior to the season, and we went to Melbourne, and in Melbourne the car was super quick, and it was only the circumstances of qualifying. I think Kimi went off in the high speed turn 12 in qualifying, otherwise he'd have qualified much better. And then obviously the race, it had rained prior to the race, and we got a little bit caught out by the tyre choice on the grid, to say the least. So when we took the blankets off on the grid, it turned out we were the only cars on, I think, intermediates, and everyone else had gone to dry tyres. So it was actually an easy decision to change the tyres. But that's a specific thing. The car was fundamentally quick. And so Yeah, it was quite a complicated season because in reality, the 18 development only detracted from the development of the 17, to be honest. The 17 was a car that was more than capable of winning the championship that year. And a lot of the developments that we could have had earlier didn't happen until later, which was a shame, because with those developments we could have had a quicker car when we needed it. But to be honest, the other problem with that car was that there was a lot of unreliability, and it's actually the unreliability that cost us the championship in the end, which was a shame. But yeah, that's the way it is. I'm afraid it's all about getting all the right choices on, making the right decisions at an early stage and pushing it through. And ultimately, we fell down in a few areas, unfortunately.
Yeah. And that's really nice to hear. I think I wanted to touch on 2 points quickly here, Mark, that you mentioned. So on Peter's point, the MP14A, and how you mentioned that it detracted from the MP417D. The first question is, what was wrong with the MP418A? Why was it constantly on fire? From what we could read about, I mean, I'm not imposing that that's what was wrong with it, but it just seemed like the car was constantly failing crash tests. I remember an F1 racing article when I was just a kid talking about like a twin clutch gearbox.
Yeah,
that was the first of its kind. It was incredible. It just seemed like a futuristic spaceship that was being tested, but could never get over the line. And then you heard rumors, Mark, and these are just rumors. I just want that Kimi and some of the others didn't want to test it anymore. And so it'd be great to hear your perspective on that. And then the other question I wanted to ask you after is, you touched on this when you talked about 2005, that there were things going on inside the team. And we've heard so much about this matrix system that was being implemented in McLaren. I mean, do you think that could have contributed to this? What are your thoughts on that? Would love to hear your perspective on all of this. I know that was a loaded question.
So going back to the 18, I think Adrian had realised that I don't think he was entirely happy with the 17 in terms of packaging, and he thought that there were areas of development available. He thought that he could repackage the car. He could repackage the car to gain advantage. He wanted to take things to the next step in terms of tightening things up to maximize aero possibilities, basically. And his way of working was very much, he had a requirement of what he wanted the car to be, and he expected the design department to fulfill those requirements. So he wasn't so interested in the absolute details of the car in terms of the distance between an exhaust pipe and a piece of bodywork. He prescribed what he wanted, and it was up to the designers to come up with the goods, shall we say. And he pushed them really hard, and maybe on the 18, he pushed them a little bit too hard, or they weren't as capable of getting to where they needed to be in the time available, shall we say. There was a change of structure in the design office, some people being brought in from outside, and that wasn't a smooth transition. So this is where people started to become a little bit of a problem within the team, that there were relationships that weren't as good as they could have been. But ultimately, the 18, it just wasn't a very good car. Aerodynamically, it wasn't as good as it should have been. Structurally, it wasn't as good as it should have been. And there were problems with things like the floor. The floor of the car was split in two halves, front to rear. And that was just a poor choice. And so it worked badly. And we had a number of accidents with that car where things failed when they shouldn't have done, because they weren't strong enough. They were being pushed too hard. And I think it is true that the drivers did say, I don't want to drive it anymore. I don't have confidence in that car. Kimi had a massive accident in Barcelona. He came out of, it was when there was the two quick corners, actually the circuit they've now gone back to, with the two quick corners before the start finish straight. And between those two corners, the car just suddenly turned left, I think, for reasons he didn't understand. And he had a big accident. And after that, he just said, unless you can explain to me why the car did that, I don't understand why the car did that. I'm not getting in it again. And I want to concentrate on the car that I have confidence in and develop that car and win the World Championship. And it was left to, I think, Alex Wirtz basically did the majority of the testing of the 18 after that. And he had a couple of nasty accidents. So there was one where he crashed in Jerez and the car caught fire. And he got a burn on his back of his neck, and I think he might still have the scar to this day. But I remember he managed to get out of the car while it was on fire, and he said that he saw the marshal with the fire extinguisher running towards the car to put the fire out, and he said he was strongly minded to rugby tackle or to tackle the marshal to stop him putting the fire out, because he wanted the car to burn so he didn't have to drive it again. So It just was a car that was not well conceived. And it was trying to push areas of design that were done wrong. But what you have to realize is that and that car, I mean, the whole twin shaft gearbox is another story, that absorbed a lot of time, effort and money and ultimately didn't work for whatever reason. But the 18 became the 19 that started 2004, and it was still a pretty poor car because aerodynamically it wasn't very good. But already by then, Adrian had realised that there were problems with that design that he wasn't happy with, and he wanted to do a new car for 2004. But there was a lot of politics within the company that said, well, we can't do that. We don't have the resources to do that. And so we started 2004 with the 19, which was really just the 18 with some changes, but not enough to make it good. But Adrian designed the 19B, which was actually really a new car. And that car incorporated all the lessons that were learned from the disaster of the 18/19. And that was a tremendous car, which won in Belgium, had lots of podium results, and led to the 20 of 2005, which was an absolutely phenomenal car. So they're all steps, aren't they, along the way to designing, getting to the solution that you want. But the 18 was just a bit of a step too far in some respects, but really it wasn't far enough in many other respects. It was a compromised design, and just showed that some of the things that Adrian and the designers wanted to do, they didn't really do them well enough to justify, and it was kind of an immature design, whereas the 17 was kind of the peak of the previous generation, and with the right development was more than capable of winning the championship. And in fact, as I said, with a more reliable season, it would have won the championship that year. So it was a bit unfortunate, but it was a great year. It's actually 2003 was my favourite year racing, because we weren't meant to win. That was kind of the feeling. Adrian had kind of said he wasn't very happy with the fact that we were racing that car because he didn't think it was good enough. And there was a very small team in the drawing office under Neil Oatley that had been tasked with sort of keeping that project going through the year whilst everyone else dealt with the 18. And it was quick. It was a quick car. It had a nice aero configuration. The drivers could use it. And we were quick a lot more often than we were supposed to be. And we were still in with the hunt for the championship right until the wire. So, yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed that year.
Mark, we're having so much fun. So, and we just love talking with you. You're still good on time, yeah?
Me is fine, as long as you are.
Okay. Well, we're more than fine. So this is just incredible for us. So,
Okay.
I guess Peter wanted to go next.
Yeah. So actually on 2003, another kind of controversial area was tyres, because something that's become a bit of a running gag on my YouTube channel with my subscribers is that whenever I talk about 2003, I mention that there was a heat wave in Europe that summer and that Ferrari's Bridgestone tyres were suffering a lot in that heat. And that was one of the reasons that Michael's results kind of gradually got worse and worse as the season went on. But then near the end of the season, there was this protest against Michelin, and you were forced to change the compounds. And there was this new compound introduced in Monaco, which had suddenly, for Williams especially, it worked amazingly, but also for McLaren. And then suddenly Ferrari won the last 3 races. With that protest, I mean, did it make a lot of difference to the performance of the car, changing the compounds back? And did you think it was fair at the time as well? Or
to be honest, I remember a number of issues with tyres in that 2003-2005 period, but I'll be honest, I can't remember which were 2003, which were 2005. In terms of compound, I don't recall compounds being a specific issue. I remember constructions being an issue. So, I mean, to go back to basics, fundamentally, I think Michelin were a better company at designing tyres than Bridgestone. That I think they, in my experience of all the companies I work with, the engineers that we work with at Michelin were the most knowledgeable, competent. They really understood what they were doing with tyres, and they had great testing facilities at Clermont-Ferrand, and money was no object in those days, and they did an absolutely fantastic job of developing the tyres in ways that, remember, this was groove tyres, and they were using the deformed shape of the tyre to effectively close up the grooves when the car was on track to maximise the contact area of the tyre. They'd realised that making large front tyres within the regulations just gave more grip, and we had to rebalance the car around those tyres. And this is the bit where maybe I'm wrong, I can't remember, but I remember there was the issue of the wide front tyre.
Yep.
And that the FIA were unhappy with the front tyre being over width. But I must admit, I thought that was 2005, but maybe it was 2003. But that was a tyre. That tyre got introduced early in the season, and it had a very strong front end performance, and the drivers couldn't cope with it initially. It was too strong. But we used it in Monaco because in Monaco you need a strong front end. So whether this is 2003 or 2005, I'm afraid I can't remember. But I just remember one year we put that tyre on for Monaco, and it was very good. And then we took it off the race team for a period of time because the drivers couldn't cope with it because it was strong. The front end was so strong. But we continued to use that tyre in testing. And it actually got to the point where the drivers adapted to that tyre such that when they went racing, they complained about not having enough front end. So then that construction and shape of tyre was brought back into race play to give the performance they were looking for. That is what I remember happening in 1 year. But I must say, as I recall, I thought that was 2005, but I'm afraid memory fades.
Mark, I think it was 2003.
Okay.
Because there's a famous clip even on YouTube where Ferrari and Bridgestone are protesting the Michelin tires on the grounds that they deform beyond the maximum tread width during the race. 2003. And then Patrick Head made that remark to a journalist when him and Ross were sort of going at it in the press conference of Indianapolis. And I think Ross Brawn was trying to explain, this is why. And a journalist was laughing, and Ross says, you have to keep laughing. Because Ross was so focused on making sure that this went through. I think he was so smart with that, and
good at that sort of thing.
So it was 2003, and we all felt like that did manipulate the championship a little bit. It was still one of the best years we've ever seen. But
it was meant to manipulate the championship because they were faced with losing the championship, and so they did everything within their power to win the championship, and you've got to realise that is part of the game, and particularly was then that the politics and the getting the FIA to ban things or whatever was all part of the game. I mean, a similar situation with the moving mass on the Renault in 2006 when they had
the mass damper. Absolutely.
So that was something that McLaren had actually asked whether they could do that, and the FIA had told them no, they couldn't. So then when we found out that the Renault actually was running it, that was why we were very unhappy, because it was something we had wanted to do and had been told that we couldn't. And then we found that the car we compete against has actually got it. And the reasons why we were told we couldn't run it were the reasons that were used to try and get it banned, which ultimately it was, but after Renault had won the championship. So it's all part of the game. And the fact is that Ross Brawn was better at playing that game than people at McLaren were, and it's all part of it, and it still is part of it, but maybe not to quite such an obvious extent anymore. But it was not the compounds, it was the construction of the tyre and the shape of the tyre that was the big deal. And I guess the Williams, I know we brought different tyres. I mean, it shows how much money was being spent on tyres at this time. They would bring two different tyres, tyres for McLaren and tyres for Williams of different constructions, because I guess the Williams probably had more of an understeer problem than we had, and so those tyres worked better for those drivers, for their drivers and their car, and maybe their drivers adapted to it a bit more quickly, potentially. But that was the nature of the game back then. It was a very expensive and intense time. And we would go to tyre tests, and we would spend 3 days at a track just testing tyres, and they would bring 4 or 5 different compounds and maybe 2 or 3 different constructions and multiples of those. And we would spend all the time doing that, because the reason you would do it was because you could find half a second a lap in a tyre, the right tyre for the right event. And you're very unlikely to be able to find half a second in any car component development instantaneously. So there just wasn't, it was worth putting that effort in, because we had to beat Ferrari. So the Michelin teams did club together to help development of the tyres. We used to have multiple team debriefs after test, where the senior engineers would go and meet Michelin, and they would discuss the tyres and come to a mutual agreement on what was best. That was the nature of the business back then.
Incredible. That is amazing to hear. I think it puts into perspective how good the tire war was from a technological perspective, the thought that went into it.
Yeah.
And it's so good to have that confirmed from someone like yourself. It makes us dream of those days too. I mean, we lack that, I think, in modern F1 in that sense.
But it was crazy. I mean, one of the things, like the development of tire transportation was a big deal. So the tire companies were having to develop these hermetically sealed containers for the tires, because if they found that, for instance, if you put a container on a ship and sent tires to Brazil, the tires that were pressed up against the sides of the containers would pick up the condensation that formed from the cold temperature inside the container, and those tires would have a different property than the tires that was in the middle of the container. So that was a big problem, that you would get a difference in tires because of the way they'd been transported. Things like that. So then they had to develop new ways of transporting the tires to avoid that sort of problem. It was incredible. I mean, we were developing tires that we would run in qualifying and then do an overnight cure to make them tougher tires, more durable tires for the race the next day. And this was actually part of the design of the compound, was to make use of that benefit. We would have faster tires in qualifying that were meant to be cured overnight to be better race tires the next day, until the FIA banned them. We had microwaves for heating tires at one point, because rather than using a tire blanket, you could heat a tire much more quickly using an enormous microwave oven. And we did a couple of tests with those, and found that it was better, because you could tune your temperatures much more effectively and get them onto the car more quickly, and you could make rapid changes to what you wanted. But the FIA banned that, because they saw that the teams are all going to have to invest in these enormous microwave ovens to bring to racetracks. Okay. I mean, it's just a crazy thing, but that's what happens when it's basically a war. It is a war. All the gloves are off. You do whatever you have to do to win.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Nedzo, you had a question, I believe.
Yes, I do. So we've been going back and forth between 2003 and 2007. Just want to go back to 2007 briefly. Obviously, it's been well documented, as you said, that Alonso didn't really gel with McLaren in terms of the fact that he didn't stay past 1 year. At what point did you see that trouble, or not trouble, but that Alonso wasn't gelling and that stuff was going wrong? At what point did it start to go in terms of that direction?
It was in those pre-season Bahrain tests when, it became apparent that apart from the fact that Fernando was struggling to adapt to the tyres, it started to become apparent that there was just some relations within the team that were not necessarily going in the direction that we had sort of expected. And it really it reached I think the Bahrain race was when it started to spill over, when we in qualifying, this was the days when we still put the race start fuel load in the cars for qualifying, and in qualifying Fernando wasn't as quick as Lewis, and it was basically decided from the pit wall that we should reduce the fuel load in Fernando's car to basically boost his qualifying performance. And I communicated that we would reduce the fuel load to Fernando, and he agreed. And it played out. I think he either matched or maybe even slightly beat Lewis's qualifying time. But what Fernando hadn't realised was that Lewis's car hadn't had a reduction in fuel load. And when he found that out, he was furious. He was absolutely apoplectic that the two cars now had different fuel loads, and if anything, Lewis's race fuel load was advantageous. And the trouble was that there were obviously conversations going on in the team at a higher level than I was at that I wasn't party to, so I didn't understand what had been agreed or what hadn't been agreed, and so games started to be played at different levels, and it was all just undermining for the conduct of the race weekends and the development of the car. It was just it hurt us. In Monaco, again, Lewis on the Friday was quite comfortably quicker than Fernando, and the problem there was that, so I can't remember what led to it, but ultimately a decision was taken again that Fernando should run a lower fuel load than Lewis in qualifying, and I think this time Lewis wasn't happy with that. I think he was convinced by people that he could carry that fuel load and still qualify on pole because of the amount that Fernando was slower. But of course, it turned out that Fernando found more time and so out-qualified Lewis. And Lewis wasn't happy, but Lewis basically was still in a strong position because all he needed to do was follow Fernando. And when Fernando stopped, he would keep going and come out in front, because in those days it was the fuel load rather than the tyres that determined your pace. So Fernando coming out on heavy fuel, even if he's on new tyres, was unlikely to be as quick as Lewis on older tyres but with a lighter car. So Lewis should have been able to drive a few quick laps, stop and come out still ahead of Fernando. But what Lewis did in that race was he pushed his tyres too hard, and he actually destroyed his tyres such that when Fernando pitted, Lewis's pace was poor. Fernando had already pulled away from him, and so Fernando was actually able to put his fresh tyres on with the fuel in the car and come back out and pull away, and that led to, I think, Lewis going to the press with his dad after the race and complaining to the British press that basically he'd been stitched up, which was not the case. It was something that had been discussed by parties within the team, and people had convinced Lewis of the benefit of what his approach was, and I think they believed it. I think they believed that he should be better off, because what they were worried about was by putting less fuel in Lewis's car, potentially other cars could beat him in the race, potentially. Obviously, the Ferraris, which was a big problem. So it was all a question of people jumping to conclusions about changes that were made, and always deciding that they were being done for negative reasons when they weren't. But fundamentally, it came down to poor communication and I should say poor management of the two drivers and their mindsets at the time. And it just became an escalating problem, really. It just grew bigger and bigger and bigger. And everything that happened from that point was perceived by one person or another to be a problem. It was a very difficult year. It was very, very difficult to manage. But then you've got two incredibly competitive people amongst a group of other competitive people, and poor decisions were made along the way. But there you go. That's what happens in that sort of situation.
It made for incredible viewing. I mean, I was a Kimi fan, so I was happy with the result that year. But it was incredible to watch from the outside, from a neutral's perspective, and you're confirming that internally it was drama as well. Yeah,
it was. It wasn't fun at all, in fact.
Yeah.
So what I said, I enjoyed working with Fernando, and I did enjoy working with Fernando, but within the team environment, this was the big difference compared to the years with Kimi and Mika beforehand. The atmosphere within the team had completely broken down, and it was very sour and unpleasant, and it was really horrible, actually.
So and we could sense that, and I think honestly, for you to go through that, it's just something that you don't see every year. So it's something to just learn from. I think probably from a team perspective, and we'll never see something quite like that again. So any of us that were watching it, we're lucky to have watched it, and those that lived through it and worked through it, like yourself, you'll never forget that. But I wanted to touch on something, because Kimi was quoted as saying, this is public, that Lewis would have, and I'm not, this is Kimi's words, and we respect all the drivers here. They're all incredible legends of the sport. We're talking about Kimi or Lewis or Fernando. But Kimi did say that he thought Lewis would have struggled had he made his debut in 2006. That's a direct quote from Kimi, and I believe his managers, the Robertsons. And what I'm trying to understand, because it's a bit cryptic, and people's passions get in the way of an honest discussion about this point. So I wanted to keep it factual and objective, but because did Lewis test on the Michelin tires early, and was Lewis struggling in those tests on the Michelins? Do you have any opinion on how that would have gone had he had started on Michelins instead of the similar compounds to GP2, the Bridgestones?
Yeah.
And, or was that because he was also testing, I think, at a track that Kovalainen out-qualified him at. Even though he got the pole at Silverstone that year in 2007, I believe Kimi made a mistake. Fernando had more fuel. What are your thoughts on that Michelin testing, early testing, and the tire change affecting Lewis's form in that sense?
He didn't do much testing in 2006. I actually ran him. I think it was the first time he drove the F1 car at Silverstone, and this was a test that was conducted because we knew Kimi was going, and the management of McLaren were trying to decide whether Lewis was the right person to drive the car in 2007, or should they be looking for somebody else. It's crazy to think that now, but at the time they didn't know whether Lewis was the right person to drive the car. And in fact, more specifically, they actually, because we had so Montoya had left the team, and we had Pedro finishing off the season in the other car, and there was actually a question mark as to whether Lewis should be put in the car at the end of 2006. Yes. Yeah. And so we were sent to Silverstone to run Lewis for a test, and I was the point of it was to assess whether Lewis was ready to actually run in 2006, and would it be advantageous to put Lewis in the car at the end of 2006 to prepare him better for 2007. Now, that test was okay, but it wasn't fantastic. I think he ended up being third quickest or something on that day. He was quite slow to get up to speed, and my feeling was he wasn't quite ready to make that step at that point. But I was just purely commenting I was asked, I gave Martin Whitmarsh a bit of a debrief afterwards, and he just asked me for my opinion. I just, Lewis was impressive, but I just felt that it was going to add a complication to our season that maybe wasn't the best thing. I suspect, and I kind of heard this afterwards, that I was told that actually Lewis didn't want to race the car in 2006. I think he wanted to concentrate on his GP2 campaign, and I suspect that the tyre, he probably drove the car at Silverstone, I suspect, and realised that there were some big differences between how the car behaved, and maybe he was smart enough to realise that he would have struggled with the Michelin car in 2006. And so I think he felt that it was better for him to just arrive on the scene in 2007 and show what he could do. So I think there's some truth in that he probably would not have been as obviously quick if he had driven the car at the end of 2006. I think some of it may have been Silverstone, because as you, I think, alluded to, in 2008, Heikki did outqualify Lewis at Silverstone quite comfortably. And in fact, in 2007, Fernando was actually quicker than Lewis, but we ran different fuel loads. It wasn't apparent that he was. In fact, and this is one of those decisions that I will maybe never live down, but I persuaded Fernando to run more fuel at Silverstone because I figured that he had the pace and it would give him a better race. And Lewis did outqualify him, I believe, and Fernando was very unhappy about that, but I was absolutely convinced that he would get the better race because of it. And in fact, he did. I think he finished second. But I think Fernando felt that he would have potentially outqualified the Ferraris if he'd run the lower fuel load. And we'll never know the answer as to whether that was true or not. So this was typical of the sorts of discussions that were being had. But yeah, I do think that one of the reasons why Lewis came in and looked so good at the start of 2007 was because we were on Bridgestones at that point, and it was a problem for Fernando and less of a problem for Lewis. And if Lewis had driven the Michelins in 2006, I suspect he would have had more trouble adapting to those. So yes, Kimi got it right, in my opinion.
So jumping forward a couple of years, at the end of 2009, you left McLaren and you moved to Renault, where you were race engineer to Vitaly Petrov. His moment in the spotlight, so to speak, would have been Abu Dhabi, where he kept Alonso behind him for a good 40 laps. As that was unfolding, first of all, were you aware that by keeping Alonso behind, it would cost him the championship? And did you have any conflicted feelings, having been his race engineer before? Or
yes, in a word. I did have some conflicted feelings, but at the end of the day, we're all competing to get the best result we can for ourselves as teams. And for Renault, it was important to do the best job we could. So the fact that Ferrari made a terrible mistake and put Fernando on a poor strategy, that was their problem, not ours. And they shouldn't have made that mistake. And it was Ferrari's mistake that cost Fernando the championship, not Vitaly doing a better job than, let's say, he would normally have done, and holding up Fernando. That Renault was a good car. He was very quick on the straights, and I think that was the problem for Fernando, is that he didn't have the straight line pace to pass, even though I'm absolutely sure his car was quicker overall. But the track, it's not a very good track for overtaking, sadly. although they've managed to make it worse since then by changing the configuration. But yeah, we were aware of what was going on, but we felt that we had to do our job as best we could, and finishing further up and not letting him through was part of that. So, and I don't think Fernando, he wouldn't argue against that either. I think he would have been very angry about the strategy he'd been put on, which was was wrong. But I don't think he would have a problem with another driver doing a good enough job to keep him behind during a race. That's the name of the game, really.
So then the following year, you moved to Mercedes and you got the opportunity to be Michael Schumacher's race engineer.
Yeah.
So with him, obviously he'd been out of the sport for a few years and he was in his 40s, but could you still see that spark that made him such a phenomenon when he was at Ferrari, and how was he different to some of the other drivers you'd race engineered before?
Yeah. So that was a quite a difficult time. The car was awful. The Mercedes car of 2011 was utterly terrible car. It had no redeeming qualities whatsoever. And Michael, I would say, probably wasn't as quick a driver in qualifying as maybe he had been. So he'd finished driving in 2006, was when he left Ferrari, wasn't it? So he had 4 years absence. No, 3 years absence. So he went back in 2010, didn't he? So I joined him in his second year at Mercedes. The thing that showed his capability was his race performances, which were fantastic generally. He normally got out-qualified by Nico Rosberg, but it was a standing joke within the team that by the end of lap 2 or 3, Michael would be in front, and that was normally the case. He was still a good race driver, and he knew his racecraft was still very good. I suspect he had underestimated the change in the cars in the period he'd been away, because they were quite different animals by that time. And I think he did struggle to come to terms with that a bit. And as I said, I think probably his qualifying pace had maybe dropped off a little bit. But I think that's what happens when drivers get older. The sort of the bravery aspect of it does tend to reduce a little bit with, shall we say, age and common sense. And also he'd had that motorbike crash that had damaged his neck. And I do wonder if that was an issue. I didn't see much evidence of it, but I gather he spent an awful lot of time in physiotherapy, having that worked on. So I think it might have presented a few problems. But the team wasn't great in the way it was working. The car was awful, and I suspect that I don't think you can be in your 40s having won the number of world championships and races that he had and still turn up every day to drive a car that you know is substandard with the enthusiasm that you might have done when you were in your early 20s. So I enjoyed working with Michael. He was great. And the thing I would say really showed his talent was adaptability. We did a test earlier in the season. We put the Pirelli wets on, and it was the first year we'd run Pirellis. And I think that might have been a factor as well for him. We put those wets on, and he did a few laps, and he came back in and he said, "Those are the worst tyres I have ever driven in my life." He said, they're just awful. And I said, "Well, look, I can see you're struggling with the balance. You've got the usual mixture of understeer and oversteer." And I said, the obvious thing to do is just take some front end out of the car to make it more manageable. And he just said, "It's a waste of time. Don't bother. The car's going to be awful on these tyres, whatever we do to it. So don't change it. I'll just drive around it." And that was his approach. And I think that is the mark of, he was a fantastic driver, but he was a fantastically adaptable driver. And I think you saw that time in, time out in his Ferrari career and his Benetton career before that. You give him a problem, he would drive to fix that problem the best he could. And I think he might not have been the quickest driver on one lap. I still think Mika probably was at that time. But in terms of getting the most out of the equipment he had at his disposal in his time at Benetton and Ferrari, I think he was absolutely the best at that. And I think I saw some of that, particularly in his race driving at that time. I mean, we nearly got a podium in Montreal. We were a little bit unfortunate, but the car just wasn't good enough. The car was awful. And I defy Nico's results weren't particularly good either. And we know how good Nico was because he's one of the few guys who's able to take it to Lewis. So it's such a shame that Michael's career ended in that way because I say he was a quicker race driver than Nico Rosberg. So let's say put it a few years ahead, that makes him a match for Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg potentially in a championship fight in good quality cars. So that to me is the mark of the guy. I think another driver in that car would not have been able to challenge Nico in the way that he actually did. It's just that nobody really noticed that that's what was going on.
Well, personally, I'm really enjoying talking about your post-McLaren years because as an Alonso fan, I've taken a liking to following the midfield since that's where Fernando has been, unfortunately. And I just wanted to ask you, what do you think separates a good race engineer from a great one? Is it more data interpretation or is it more driver management and their emotions? That is purely subjective. It's just to know.
I find that quite a difficult question because, I was a race engineer that I did my job. So I know why the team worked and why we got results when we did and why we didn't get results. As to the differences between race engineers, I don't know. I mean, I think you have to have a feel for the car and what you're trying to achieve. You have to be able to make fast decisions. You have to be able to analyze problems with multiple inputs and try and rationalize them as quickly as you can down to the most important influences. You have to develop a good relationship with the driver. You have to try and get under his skin a little bit or inside his mind a little bit and understand what makes him tick and try to use that to your advantage. Have to be calm when the pressure's high. I mean, I think one of the things I noticed was when I was at McLaren, when I started, I just told myself, look, you've been put in an incredibly important position, but these people have put you in that position because they believe you can do that job. So I used to use that to convince myself that that's justified me being in that position, regardless of whether I thought I was good enough to do it or not, and just get on with the job that was at hand. I think you have to be quite basic in your approach in some ways, in that you just have to do what needs to be done at the moment it needs doing, and not try to reduce complication is another thing. I think some people can get a bit overwhelmed by complication, and it's important not to let that happen, because ultimately it is a very complicated thing, and I don't think anyone can deal with all those things effectively. So you just have to convince yourself, well, as long as I do most of the things right most of the time, that's as good as anybody can expect. And as long as the people in it who are my bosses agree with that, they'll keep me doing the job. And if the driver's happy with what I'm doing, then he'll be, it all just works together. And as soon as that doesn't work, then you realize that you won't be doing that for much longer. So I'm not sure that's a very satisfactory answer, but I tried not to overanalyze that too much. And I just tried to literally sit down and use the tools I had available to me to do the job that I thought was the right thing to do at any one time. And I was quite hard on myself when things went badly. And it always helps when you have people supporting you. I'd say that's probably one of the biggest aspects for any person, is to have people around you who are supporting you in what you're doing. And when you lose that support, that's when it becomes a lot more difficult. So probably I would say that the times I did the best job was with Mika or Kimi, or to some extent with Fernando, because, and latterly, I would say my time with Nico Hülkenberg I also enjoyed, was because I felt that I had the support of the people around me. and that made the job easier to do, and it made it easier to challenge the sort of maybe the perceived standard. Sometimes you have to do things a little bit differently, make choices that aren't maybe obvious, but if everyone you're working with believes in you and trusts you, then you can do that, and if it works, that's great. And I think another important thing is when things do go wrong, people don't criticize too much, because if on balance you're making the right choices, everyone makes mistakes from time to time. And I do absolutely stand by the fact that with Kimi, with Mika, with Fernando, I don't remember those guys ever saying to me that they thought I'd done a bad job. And I think that's fantastic, because it's such a competitive atmosphere that you kind of need that. But it works both ways, doesn't it? You've got to have respect for people. And when situations have been not so good is when there's been less of a feeling of respect between individuals, I would say.
Well, that's
Mark,
really
before Nav asks his other question, I just want to point out to the audience that when Kimi went back to Lotus, there's a story that he communicated with Jackie Stewart to get you back as his race engineer.
That's true.
And that speaks volumes of for Kimi Räikkönen to specifically ask to have a race engineer. I mean, that says it all, Mark. So, we definitely think you've done a more than good job. As a Kimi fan, when you were behind that engineering wall, we felt comfortable. And I'm not putting down any other engineers, but we knew Mark Slade is the guy that knows. He's the grandmaster. He knows exactly what Kimi wants, what Mika wants, and so forth. So that was your reputation.
Yeah, to be honest, when he did that, he was being a little bit selfish, obviously, because he was going into a situation where he didn't know people, and he just made the simple calculation. If there's somebody who I do know and do have a level of trust in available, then it's probably going to make my life better if they're involved. And the fact is that I hadn't had the best year at Mercedes, and I had been moved off the race team. So I wasn't actually available. I was supposed to have 2 more years at Mercedes, but fortunately, it was able to be negotiated out. But it was a surreal experience to be phoned by Jackie Stewart, I have to say. That was a very bizarre moment.
You grew up watching him, as you mentioned at the beginning, and then he calls you and says, "Look, Mark, your old friend, your old driver wants you back." I mean, that must have been such a proud moment. I mean, that's just awesome.
Yeah. Well, the thing was, I was phoned at Mercedes by it was actually Gary Anderson's wife, who worked as a headhunter. I don't know if they were still married at the time, but I got a call from her to say that would it be okay for Jackie Stewart to call me that evening. He wouldn't say why. So I thought that was very odd. And then sure enough, I was at home in the evening and the phone rang and, "Hello, Mark, it's Jackie Stewart." It's like, this is surreal. I cannot believe this is happening. And then he explained why. And the bizarre thing, it was actually to work for Kimi to go to Williams. It wasn't Lotus. It was Williams that they were trying to do a deal with at the time. But obviously that deal fell through, and then they moved on to Lotus. But I was even happier about it, because obviously I'd been with that team the year before, and I'd actually really enjoyed working with that team. It was only the prospect of working with Michael at Mercedes, and the fact that at the end of 2010, the position with Renault did look a little unstable. It wasn't guaranteed that they would have a long future. So that was the only reason I'd left that team. And also I have to say, not just the fact that I was getting the opportunity to work with Michael Schumacher, but Vitaly Petrov, with the best will in the world, wasn't going to be the greatest racing driver of all time. So inevitably, it just seemed like something I would want to do. I mean, it didn't pan out that way, as it turned out. But I was very happy to go back to what I already knew was a great team and to work with a great driver. So it was kind of, Christmas.
Brilliant. Nav, you have a question, I believe, on the tires.
Yes. So I was going to say, you go back with the Kimi. There is a Kimi Part 2, which I think is not too common for two race engineers and, well, a race engineer and a driver to partner at two different teams. And in 2012, he has this very, very good season, which I think impressed a lot of people because, as we know, when drivers take a break, anything could happen. They could be back on it, or they could be struggling. And Kimi was exceptional. That was my first taste of. I started watching in 2007 as well, but I was quite young. And by 2010-11, I really started to understand what was going on, and I was like, "This guy is really good." And in 2013, he wins the first race, and Fernando Alonso is also competing, and Sebastian Vettel is also competing. So going into the Spanish Grand Prix, well, just after the Spanish Grand Prix, it's really looking like it's going to be a three-way threat for the title.
Yeah.
And then, well, Ciaron agrees with me on this, a big event happens, which kind of gets glossed over, according to me, which is Pirelli changed the tires.
Yeah.
Do you think that if that had not happened, we would have had a three-way fight for the title, or was Vettel always going to run away with it? Because at that point, Kimi, Alonso, Vettel, it could have been an all-time great season, but in the end, it was remembered for Vettel winning 9 in a row.
So. Sure. It was a factor. So if you look at the qualifying record of 2013, I think I'm right in saying that Kimi out-qualified Romain Grosjean, I think, in every race until the tyres were changed, which was after the Silverstone race where we had lots of failures. And they particularly changed the front construction, and Kimi no longer had the strong front end that he preferred. And I think Romain out-qualified him. I think Romain might have even out-qualified him the next 5 races or 6 races or something. Certainly it swung the qualifying battle, and that was because Kimi wasn't as happy with the balance of the car on those revised Pirellis. However, he still beat Romain in the races more often than not. But there were other factors involved. Mainly, I would say that the team was running out of money. The issue of Kimi not being paid came up. He basically had entered into a deal with the people at Lotus he got paid a fairly low basic salary, but he was on a points bonus that was pretty big. And I think they'd calculated it on the basis of their expectation of the points of 2011. And I think Kimi managed to score something like 10 or 20 times more points than they expected over his time at the team. And that, as I understand it, and this is a little bit hearsay, I understand that basically they went to Kimi and said, look, we can't afford to pay you the amount of money that you've earned. And if we do pay you, then the team will have to close down. And I remember it was in Korea. I remember having lunch with him on one of the days, and he just said, well, it's not my fault they ended up such a stupid effing deal, is it? And I just said, no, it isn't. But that's the situation. And the team owners, I think, that it was costing them a lot more to run a Formula One team than they had expected it was going to, generally. And I think they were kind of losing their enthusiasm for it. And it hurt us as a team. It obviously, Kimi's mindset was affected by that. And also the way the team was operating was being affected by it. So combine that with the Pirelli tyre situation, it just put us on a negative trajectory. On top of that, we were still looking at being 4th in the Constructors' Championship, which would have demoted Ferrari to 5th. And Kimi was going to drive for Ferrari in 2014. That Kimi hurt his back in Singapore. I think he drove over a curb or something and suffered a pretty hefty impact. and it exacerbated an injury that I think he picked up when he drove for Sauber. He had a big shunt in Manicourt in testing in 2001, and he'd always got some underlying back problems because of that. And I think this incident in Singapore brought that back. And so he was in quite a lot of pain, which he got around with some fairly severe pain relief in that race. But I think that was also a factor in him being in the car subsequently. So yeah, all these things combined to sort of unfortunately blunt our quest for the championship. I've been told that Ferrari put quite a lot of pressure on him at the end of the year. I never saw any evidence of that. If you remember in qualifying in Abu Dhabi, he was going really well. I think he qualified fourth, but he ran wide coming out of turn 3, and the front floor stay got broken. You know, the strut that supports the front of the T-tray that we used to have. And the FIA decided that that was a systematic failure that gave us beneficial performance, because we'd had a similar failure on Roman's car on one occasion earlier in the season. And they basically disqualified us from qualifying and put Kimi to the back of the grid. And I think that was the final nail in the coffin, because, we had next to no chance of getting a good result from that position. I'm afraid in the team, we felt that was a decision that was completely unfair, because it wasn't systematic. It wasn't like we were breaking them at every opportunity. It wasn't something that we intended to happen, but we couldn't help think that it was somewhat advantageous for Ferrari to have us taken out of the picture at that stage in the season. Obviously, no evidence for that. It may well not have been the case, but you get a little bit paranoid in those situations when things start to go against you. In the race, Kimi made a desperate lunge down the inside of someone at the turn 1 and broke the suspension of the car, and he walked away, and we never saw him again. He didn't come back to the office, and that was a real shame. He got in his car and he drove off. And we had to find another driver for the final 2 or 3 races of the year. 2 races, yeah.
That's an incredible ending, to just walk off. Go in his house.
Yeah, but that's Kimi, isn't it? You know.
Exactly. Well, it is quite interesting that your voice will perhaps better be immortalized as the words that come before "Leave me alone, I know what I'm doing."
That wasn't me.
That was Simon Rennie. That wasn't Mark. I think Mark, you had told Simon not to say that, if I'm not mistaken.
No. So, situation was that Simon had been race engineer in 2011. And he's a very good guy, very, very capable race engineer. But because Kimi wanted me to work with him in 2012, that had to be accommodated. And I think it's all. Simon was incredibly good about it. It must have been really gutting for him to have to. So basically, we both ran the car in as much as Simon was the voice on the radio on the pit wall at races, and was obviously involved in decision making. But he was given other roles within the team to do across the race weekend. And I sort of did the sort of, should we say, the essential race engineering for Kimi that year. But Simon was a fantastic person and a fantastic race engineer, and he later went on to great success at Red Bull that he moved to for 2014 onwards. Anyway, but it wasn't me. But
amazing.
All I would say is that I wouldn't necessarily have said those things to Kimi. I'm not saying that Simon was wrong to do so, but I just having known the state of mind that Kimi had in those pressure situations, I wouldn't necessarily have said it. That's all. But that's because I knew.
To have Mark Slade and Simon Rennie as your engineers, I mean, that's a dynamic duo in itself. We know how good both of you are from your careers. So I don't think that moment speaks anything other than it's a classic moment. It was funny, but it doesn't. I don't think anyone looks at it as, in anything other than just it was funny, because both of you are obviously two of the best in the business.
It led to some T-shirts that were handed out afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. So I think Peter has a question to quickly. Peter, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah. So before we move on, I wanted to ask quickly about Michael, actually, because there's often been this kind of narrative and certainly a lot of claims in German media that one of the reasons that Mercedes was so dominant in the hybrid era is because they'd started power unit development as early as 2007, and that Michael himself had actually been spearheading a lot of that development when he joined the team. Is there much basis to that, or is that more of a myth? Or
I can only say that I'm not aware of him having any involvement in it.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
In that, it was 2011. I mean, very definitely, Mercedes, the engine division was well ahead of the game in terms of developing their power unit. In fact, they had a 4-cylinder engine up and running before the regulations were changed at Ferrari's request, because Ferrari basically said that they didn't want to run a 4-cylinder engine; it was bad for their image, and that the least number of cylinders they would accept was 6. So that's why it got changed to a V6, as I understand it. But and Mercedes had to start, change their program. But I don't think the other engine manufacturers had anything going at that point. So Mercedes just did a fantastic job of realizing how difficult a challenge it was going to be and working towards it. I mean, it may well have been that Michael was involved in it. I don't know, but in my time, I didn't have any discussions about it with Michael at that time, and I don't remember him bringing it up at all. And there wasn't much discussion about it back then because it was still a long way off in the future. So, I'd be surprised, is all I can say. And I'm not aware of anything.
Right.
But that isn't to Michael's detriment. It shouldn't have any bearing on people's perception of Michael Schumacher as a driver. Maybe they were clutching at straws and trying to come up for reasons why Michael was still great. But the fact is, Michael was still great. So he doesn't need that sort of stuff to make him seem any better. Look at his achievements. That's all you need to do.
Moving on to another driver then. Obviously, you then worked with Pastor Maldonado, who, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated drivers of all time. Obviously, he's been known for his kind of, let's say, antics, and he at times was a bit inconsistent. But I thought that 2015 was a really well put together season from him, and that he actually managed to cut down on some of those errors, and towards the end of the year went on a really good run of form. Do you think that had he stayed on further beyond 2015, that he would have gone on to do more?
Not necessarily, to be honest. I think Pastor's focus had changed over time. I agree. I think he fundamentally had some talent. Obviously, you don't win the GP2 championship without having talent. But he had a problem in knowing where his limit was, in my opinion. And he was either over the limit or under the limit a lot of the time. And I think he found it difficult to know where that limit was. So a lot of the mistakes and accidents came because he was driving a bit over the limit. But his tendency was if he tried to control that, he would then underperform. So I think he's the sort of he wasn't going to be a world champion. The fact that he won that race with Williams was kind of astonishing because he drove incredibly well that day. I mean, he did drive very, very well that day. He held off Fernando and Kimi behind him in good cars. So absolutely take nothing away from him for doing that. But the Renault wasn't, sorry, not the Renault, the Lotus at that time wasn't a particularly good car. And Roman did have the measure of him most of the time. Underrated. Yeah, I think he gets a stick that he shouldn't have had. But I think it's fair to say, there have been better drivers in Formula One than Pastor Maldonado. There have also been worse drivers, but he was of a standard, and in a better car, he would have done a better job, no question. But I think he was. I think he had a family, a wife, and young kids, and I got the impression that they were starting to become a more important part of his life.
Yeah. It makes sense to us, Mark. Good to hear your views on that. Now, one thing, moving on here from that, I think one thing I've always been fascinated by, I think everyone on this call, is how many different career tracks actually exist inside of these F1 teams. I mean, some of these engineers, you see them go down the mechanical design route. You sort of started off like that. Others go into performance, some into strategy. Some of these race engineers just stay in their role, and they're very connected to the driver. And you spent the better part of, what was it, 30 years, 25, 30 years as a race engineer. Then you became a chief engineer briefly in 2016. And what I'm wondering is, could you talk us through what, first of all, drew you to the race engineering pathway rather than a pure design or aero role? And then as that chief engineer, how did that role differ from your earlier years as a race engineer? Did you enjoy that hands-on weekend environment or that role better? It'd be great to hear about those differences and those different dynamics when you became a chief engineer in general.
So, obviously, as a fan, I always enjoyed racing, watching racing, reading about racing. When I went to Reynard's, I didn't have much opportunity to go trackside, but I had one or two occasions, and I really enjoyed the environment, being at the front line. When I joined McLaren, I was very much office based, and initially I found that very exciting. But I must admit, after a while, I started to feel that I couldn't envisage being in the drawing office forever, because I wanted to get involved in the direct coalface and competitive environment that I thought was that's what racing was about. And really, once I was lucky enough to get involved in that, it is that being at the front in those high pressure situations that I really enjoyed. I mean, testing is a step back from that, and I found that whilst it was an important element, and I still think we did a very good job of it as a team, it was that step back. Even that step back was enough to take away some of the enjoyment. So for me, it's about competition. It's about proving yourself and the team week in, week out that was actually important. And I'll be honest, I was, although I was an engineer, I really quickly realised I wasn't as clever as some of the other people involved in terms of that aspect of it. I think early on, when things were a bit more basic and a bit cruder, you could get away with not being a fantastically proficient engineer in the true sense. But as time went on, the technical aspect developed in a way that you had to be extraordinarily capable as a design engineer. And I don't think I had the level of capability necessary to do that job. But I felt that I did have organizational skills and ability to assess things and sort of look at the symptoms of the problems that we had and make decisions. I thought I was still pretty decent at that. So that's really why I went down that path. And I enjoyed working with people in a high pressure environment. Being in the drawing office, they're quite quiet, low key places. And I did find that a little bit stifling, whereas being on a race team, when you've got, 20 mechanics on your car and fuel going in and noise, and I just thrived. I really enjoyed that environment when it was going well. I became chief engineer at Renault really by accident, because a few people had left at the end of 2015 to get involved in the Haas project. And we were kind of missing someone. And I was asked to do the role for a time. And actually, it was against my better judgment. I didn't really want to do it. I had been asked at McLaren whether it was something I would be interested in, and I'd actually said no, because I didn't think it played to my strengths as a person, to be honest. And the year at Renault as chief engineer kind of confirmed my worst fears in many ways, in that I didn't particularly enjoy it. It wasn't a good year in as much as, although Renault had taken over the team, we hadn't really had the funding to move forward very well at the end of 2015. So it was a very last minute change. The 2016 car was really the 2015 car with a Renault engine in the back of it instead of a Mercedes, with very little development. And frankly, the Renault engine wasn't as good as the Mercedes. And the car the previous year hadn't been a great car, even with the Mercedes engine in, which was a very good engine. So we were kind of up against it. We had, obviously, Kevin came on board with Joe Palmer, two pretty young guys, relatively inexperienced. And I just don't think it was a very good environment for them either, in as much as the car wasn't very good, the engine was pretty poor. The team had lost an awful lot of talented people, and it was a very difficult environment to work in. And I just found that I became a kind of a middleman, without much direct input when it came to the race weekends. So I was a little bit of a fish out of water. It wasn't great. It was interesting. A couple of years later, one of the guys who was a race engineer at that time, he sort of said, "Well, there were some good things that you did do that year in terms of the way you tried to involve everybody, pull the team of race engineers together, and have more discussions about what we were trying to do." So I accepted that, but I don't think I did a great job of working with the people who were sort of my seniors, in terms of keeping them up to speed. And there were some expectations, I think, that were a bit unrealistic about what we could do as a team. So yeah, it was a messy environment, and I was actually quite relieved when Ciaron Pilbeam was taken on to be chief engineer, and basically I was put back to being a race engineer, but with Nico Hulkenberg, who I had a lot of time for, as a racing driver. So I was actually very happy to be put back into the position of, making decisions live, shall we say, as opposed to being someone who had to plan ahead. Maybe that reflects on me, but I'm maybe not the best planner in the world and the best communicator in the world.
You're too humble, Mark, but
I think so.
we know that. You're too humble. You are a legend, in my opinion. So, but okay, I mean, if you're being humble, we'll accept that. But I think Peter had a question on your Haas stint, and then we're going to move to the closing section after that. It's okay. Yeah. So, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, so when you were at Haas, obviously you were there during the tenures of both Gunther Steiner and Ayao Komatsu.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would agree that their fortunes have improved quite a lot since Ayao took over as team principal. So what do you think he's doing differently that's making that difference?
It's a little bit of a tricky one. I mean, you got to appreciate that Haas's performance is quite dependent on Ferrari's mechanical package. They buy the engine, gearbox, front and rear suspension from Ferrari because they don't have the resources to develop all the stuff themselves. It's a Haas chassis, and Haas do all of their own aero development, so that is entirely Haas. But they're a tiny little team. I mean, you would not believe how small that team is compared to even the next biggest team. I think they're almost half the size. So that's why it's a very difficult environment, and they are very much at the whim of Ferrari's mechanical parts. And the reason I want to stress that is because you would say, okay, but they're buying a Ferrari engine, gearbox, suspension, great, that must be brilliant. And it isn't, because the suspension works in conjunction with the aero. They are intrinsically related. And so if the aero doesn't work in conjunction with the suspension, or should I say more correctly, the suspension doesn't work in conjunction with the aero, you've actually got a problem. And I think that has been a problem for Haas when the Ferrari aero probably works differently in terms of the ride height performance has probably been very different than that of the Haas. And so you provide with a suspension that's designed to work with one type of performance, and you haven't got that performance. And then some of the features of that suspension actually create problems for you. And that was certainly the case in 22 and 23, in that the suspension didn't allow us to operate the car we needed it to. And for 24, it became much more, the aero and suspension were much more in tune with each other. And that happened to coincide with when Io took over, being team principal of the team. And the car just worked a lot better. But that was, in my opinion, that immediate improvement in performance. Io hadn't had enough time to make big changes, but at that point. But it was just that the car was a better car. And so we had better performance. Particularly in terms of tyre management, tyre longevity. But fundamentally, what Io is, he's an engineer, a proper engineer. He's an engineer, and he looks at it more from an engineering perspective than maybe Gunter did. Gunter's more of a people person, should I say, which I think we see in the way he communicates with the outside world. And so they're just different people, and they approach things in different ways. There were some personnel changes within the team other than Io and Gunter, which actually happened under Gunter before he left the team. And I think those changes actually had some beneficial effect as well. And then one of the good things that Io did was allow the people that were there in design to maybe express themselves a bit more freely. And he sort of rearranged a few people into positions that he needed people to do jobs because people had left. And he didn't have a lot of choice but to rearrange the people he had because he didn't have time to employ new people. But he's quite a good judge of character, and he put some people in positions that where they did good jobs. So I think that helped as well. But the fact is, look at this year, I think it's fair to say that Haas haven't progressed beyond where they were in 24. If anything, they regressed a little bit, and they seem to be coming on stronger now towards the end of the season, particularly with Ollie Behrman. But I think that's very much circumstantial, I suspect, in terms of again, going back to that interaction between suspension and aero, and just the capability that Haas has a team to develop is much restricted compared to the bigger teams. It's always been amazing, to be honest, that Haas haven't finished 10th every year they've been involved in Formula One, because for the size of the team, that should be where they finish, even with the other components they have, because the other teams have more resources and should be able to do a better job. But I think it's a reflection that Haas have done a good job with the resources available to them, and the fact that other teams have not done as good job with the resources available to those teams, that Haas actually are able to outperform them. So yeah, it's a tricky situation, but Io and Gunter are very different people and approach it in different ways, and they have different strengths and weaknesses. But I think it's pleasing to see Haas doing well, given the resources they have available to them, and it'll be interesting to see how they develop in the future. I think that's where Io's input will be seen, is how they develop over the next 3, 4, 5 years, because obviously with Toyota coming in as a technology partner, that's going to be an interesting one to watch. I think they were brought in to try to help Haas with the resources that they are lacking in terms of particularly research and development. And if Haas are able to harness those resources, then it should be a big step forward.
That actually makes a lot of sense, Mark. And, I think that's good context and color on, why we see some shift in performances. It's not always down to the reasons we think. Like you said, it can be circumstantial, other reasons. So it's fascinating to see that. I think we're going to transition to the closing part of this discussion, Mark. And I think, big picture, First question: what was your favorite era to be a race engineer? Given that you raced across all, so many different eras, so many different rules. What was your favorite era?
As I said, 2003 was my favorite season.
Yeah. Is that the favorite era, like in general, that V10 era?
I'm not sure. Yes, there are differences. I suppose what I enjoyed was when I had probably the most influence. That it was personally satisfying to think that you had made a positive contribution to a race weekend. I know that sounds very egotistical, so apologies for that. But I think it's inevitable to people that, I love being part of a team at all times. But the times when I felt I was able to contribute to the success of the team were the times that I got the most enjoyment out of it. So at McLaren in the early 2000s, we had a really good bunch of people. The car was good. The drivers were great. The team culture was good. And what was developing at McLaren in that period was a really good vehicle dynamics department. There were some really smart people at McLaren, Paddy Lowe, a chap called Dick Glover, and they kind of realised that the future would need an improvement in, shall we say, scientific capability. And they started bringing in some really, really clever young people into McLaren who worked on sort of the theoretical basis of the car. And because that period started while I was there, you could tell that there was change coming because of that. But I thought that was just normal. That's how it was going. When I went from McLaren to Renault, I realised their departments were just so far behind in that capability. I was absolutely astonished. I really was. And even to this day, there were capabilities that McLaren had in the mid-2000s that I don't think all the teams have even today. So in terms of things like the data representation, so we had a strategy software in 2001 that was Monte Carlo theory based. Teams are still using that now. They're now moving beyond that into AI assistants and stuff like that. But I had in front of me a monitor where I could see the forecast of how the race was going to progress, and I could manipulate that forecast based on changing conditions to see what different strategies would work. And it was phenomenally helpful. When I went to Renault, they had literally nothing. They had nothing like that. They also developed a data representation of how the race was progressing. So the GPS map that all the teams have available to them now, we had that based on just lap time and sector information. There was no GPS on the cars, but we were trying to develop a system to give us that sort of information at that time, to the point where we actually had people typing in lap time sectors live to try and create something. And then we moved on to screen recognition, because obviously that's an incredibly inefficient way of doing it. So basically there were people in the team that were pushing technology, pushing what was capable of being doing in a way that no other team, I think, at that time was doing. And so it was just great to be part of something that not only was successful in itself, but also trying to push the boundaries, and to be part of a team, a group of people that have a vision and an objective and work in a cooperative way. That's good fun. And, I'd recommend it for anybody. If you can find yourself in a position like that, in whatever environment you're working in, that is the best feeling, that you're a part of a group moving forwards. So that's, for me, that was the best one.
That makes so much sense. And you really felt the atmosphere back then from the technological. You felt like McLaren was that scientific team as well, not just because of the MTC in 03 that was built. Even before that, I mean, you just felt like you guys were the ones that were combining scientific precision with performance with two of the fastest drivers ever. It was just awesome to witness from the outside.
And it was part of McLaren's problem is that they actually lost that in the period after 2010. They actually moved away from that philosophy, and it was a dark time. 2012 even after that, and they went into a very bad way of working, and their performance suffered as a result. And it's taken them until sort of the last 3 or 4 years to actually recover from that bad period, which was I have to say it was a shame to watch it. The decline of McLaren in the period of 14, 15, 16 was quite
13, really 13, 14,
yeah. It was a bad time, and they just had some people involved who were making poor choices, and they lost sight of what it was that had worked for them in the past. But I think they've got good people back there now, and it's good to see them getting back up there.
Mark, and that's incredible to hear. I think Nedzo has a question, but before he asks that question, I have a super quick question that I forgot to ask earlier.
Okay.
And we don't need to belabor this point, but we talked about your relationship with Kimi. Did you ever think about following him to Ferrari? Because that was something that was rumored. I remember Karun Chandok even tweeted that in 2013, saying, "I wonder if Mark Slade will go with Kimi to Ferrari," because a lot of us Kimi fans were worried that if you're not there, it could be a difficult transition, frankly. But was that ever on the cards?
Well, it's interesting you asked that, because in 2006, Kimi and his management wanted me to go to Ferrari for 2007, but I was actually under contract to McLaren for I can't remember how many more years. I think probably 2 more years. But even if I could have gone with him, I decided that it wasn't the right thing for me to do, for a number of reasons. One was simply I got married in 2000. We had a very young family, and we as a family felt that it wouldn't be good for us to decamp to Italy, for my wife to be basically on her own in Italy with 3 very small children and me away most of the time working with the team. So that was a factor. But the other thing I felt was that Ferrari was a very successful team, and had obviously got some very good people. And so for me to be parachuted into an existing team of good people was unlikely to work. The reason it worked in McLaren was because I was part of that team. I had kind of grown up with the people at McLaren, and they were as much a part of why I was where I was as the other way around. Whereas the idea of being parachuted into an existing team just felt to me like that should actually be quite destructive and negative for Kimi. That was a factor in my mind. I felt he would be better off having an engineer who understood the Ferrari system and how Ferrari worked as a team. It was quite early on that I decided that wasn't the right thing to do. When it came to him leaving Lotus in 2013, he actually didn't bring it up, and I wouldn't have gone anyway. And in fact, I think I said to him, look, before, I don't even know if you're going to ask, and maybe you're not, but just in case there are any thoughts at all, I said I wouldn't want to do that anyway. And he just was like, yeah, fine, no problem. I know, interestingly, I was offered an amount of money to work for Ferrari back in 2006, and it was quite a large amount of money, which did make my eyes open a little bit. And apparently when I turned it down, so I spoke to his managers at the time, the Robertsons, and apparently they said to Kimi, maybe we didn't offer him enough money. And he said to them, no, you don't bother. You're wasting your time. If he's decided that he doesn't want to do it, it's not because of the money. And I was really pleased to hear that, because that I think that was the essence of my relationship with him. is that we understood each other. He was a racer, and I felt I was a racer, and we weren't doing it for the money. We were doing it because it was something that we loved doing, and I think he got it completely in terms of family and what our priorities were. So it wasn't really something I was going to do, and I don't regret it either. I was so happy when he won the championship in 2007. We were actually staying in the same hotel. Ironically, I was stood at reception in that hotel on I think it was the Tuesday or Wednesday before that race weekend in 2007. And he came in at the same time. And we all thought it was a bit odd because Ferrari weren't staying at that hotel. And apparently he had gone to the hotel that he was supposed to stay at and decided he didn't like it. And he'd stayed at the hotel we were, because it was the same hotel that McLaren had used. Well, obviously I was still at McLaren, so he decided that was the hotel he wanted to stay at. So he just drove to that hotel and went up to reception and asked for a room. And obviously they wouldn't necessarily have had a room. But anyway, he ended up staying at the same hotel as he stayed at the year before. So on the Sunday evening after the race, I went to the bar in the hotel, and he was there with a couple of his friends and Mark Arnold. And I was just so ecstatic to see him happy. And, we said hi, and I just said, well done. And we had a bit of a hug and, shook hands, and it was fun. It was quite early, so it was before any postseason parties or anything. You could just tell how much it meant to him. And I was just really pleased to be able to say well done to him, because it was great, even though we'd lost,
Yeah, I think before Nedzo asks this question, I'm just going to add something to that, and then Nedzo will just jump in. It just looked from the outside that your McLaren crew and Kimi had an exceptional relationship by the end of 2006. And I think Kimi probably has never forgotten that, it's beautiful to hear that you had that moment, even after that season. I mean, has there ever been a season like that in recent history? I mean, that was just a total brawl between both teams. And the first three drivers. It was just wild to watch. And, it shows the respect that didn't change, that Mark Slade was still appreciative of Kimi, and Kimi was still probably fine.
Same with everybody. All the guys in the team loved him. And I think, after he left Ferrari, when he went back to Ferrari, so he's done this twice, left a team and gone back to team. I think he had a huge amount of respect at Ferrari as well. I think the people there love him. So he is a really good person to have in the team. When he was at Renault, the Lotus, the team loved him. He's a very down-to-earth, straightforward guy. He loves racing. And, some people ask why he carried on racing as long as he did. And it's because he loves driving racing cars. He drove NASCAR trucks because he wanted to try it out. He did rallying because he wanted to try it out. He won, the biggest skidoo race in the world. He won that one year. He's been speedboat, powerboat racing. He just likes competitive environment, and now he's the happiest man alive because his kid's doing karting and successful, and you can see how much he's enjoying that. So, he's a terrific character.
Amazing. Nedzo, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I have kind of two questions rolled into one here. So, we've been talking about Ciaron talked about your favorite era to be a race engineer. What do you think was the best era for determining driver skill? Like, are there certain eras do you think that, for example, like the groove tires or the refueling or some aspect of the regulations or the car regulations or the sporting regulations that allowed certain drivers to flourish rather than others?
I think different eras have highlighted different capabilities. So, for instance, the current era, tyre management is absolutely key. And on top of that, I think there's always been a requirement for the driver to adapt to the characteristics of the cars of the generation. So the current generation are very stiff, and the Pirelli front tyre is quite weak. So the cars tend to have a lot of mid-corner understeer. So the drivers who can adapt to that are doing the best job. I mean, you go back years, can't you? I mean, I think when ground effects came in the late 70s, some drivers adapted to that better because they could deal with the high G loads, the incredibly high G loads that suddenly came in, and they came in quite quickly as well. So you got drivers like Alan Jones who just from sheer physical strength was able to get the most out of a car of that type, and some of the drivers who'd been successful before struggled a bit more with that. Or then you look at the period of the active cars, like Nigel Mansell doing such a fantastic job with the Williams of 92, whereas Riccardo Patrese, who had been close on performance with him in 91, in 92 he was struggling with that because he didn't have the confidence in the car that Nigel Mansell had at that time. When you look at the period of strategy, I think it's fair to say that, you know, Michael stood out as being a driver who could adapt to the requirements of a race, you know, to switch from maybe a 2-stop to a 3-stop and turn on the pressure when he needed to. So I think, I'm not sure there's been any one era that has shown a driver to stand out particularly overall. I think it's just that different eras have suited different drivers in different ways, and maybe if the rules had been different at different times, we might have had other drivers who would have stood out at that time. So that's all I can say really. I'm not sure there's one era that stands out, but I think different eras have shown the benefit, allowed different drivers to highlight certain characteristics. But I do think people underestimate the input of the driver in the current era. I think actually it's one of the most difficult eras for drivers. I think a driver can come in and be quick-ish, but to actually excel in the current era is pretty hard. The cars aren't particularly nice to drive. They're quite difficult. And to get the most out of them, both on a qualifying basis and in a race situation, is hard. And they're actually quite unpredictable as also going from one event to another. It's not always clear to the teams why their cars are working well at one event and less well at another event. And there's an awful lot of complication in the way the cars are set up and managed. The rules are very complicated now in terms of the way outlaps have to be managed and all that stuff. It's an incredible amount for the drivers to deal with mentally. So maybe you could make an argument that actually now is probably the era where the drivers have to manage the most that they ever have had to for good or for bad, arguably. Because I think the current generation of cars, and I'm going to say tyres, are a factor in why the races are very difficult for the drivers to manage, and overtaking is very difficult. And I think that's a bit of a shame. And I think some of the rules about how they're allowed to overtake each other are not necessarily the best. But again, the drivers who use those to their own advantage are the cleverest in many ways. And I think that in the future, that's only going to become more complicated. The cars of 2026, I think, are going to be quite different and quite difficult. I'm not sure that the racing is really going to be better. I think it might actually be quite a lot worse. But we'll see. But it certainly is going to be very demanding for the drivers. Yeah. And it's not a time for pure outright racers, is it? You know, it's not the guy who's got the most talent when it comes to just driving a car fast who's going to win. You've got to be a lot more than that these days. And I think that probably is something that's changed over time. Yeah, that's all I can say, really.
That's really interesting because I remember seeing Jacques Villeneuve doing an F1 test for French TV. I think it was this year or last year. And he kept racing. He was in the World Endurance Championship as recently as 2023. So he kept racing at quite a high level. And he did say things very similar to you, which is he kept listening to other analysts say that, oh, those cars are quite easy to drive because those Formula 2 drivers are instantly performing. Mm. And he got in the car and he tried to push for one lap, and he just told, I think it was Ocon with him, who was like, no, we can't do that. How are you doing this?
Yeah. Yeah. And but the advantage is that those F2 drivers have driven Pirelli tyres. So there are going to be similarities in the way the tyres behave. And I think that is absolutely crucial to it. I don't think people appreciate how influential the current tyres performance is on the outcomes of races. It would be good if people could understand it, and I think that the race coverage could be significantly improved to allow people to understand what's going on. But it is a very, very big impact on how races proceed. And we saw in Brazil, we had a good race in Brazil, largely because of the circumstances of the tyres. The fact that the hard tyre was so hard that it was unusable, but the teams didn't realise that until too late because of the sprint format, effectively. And then the fact that the soft tyre performed differently to the medium tyre, and different numbers of stops and the different number of tyres that were available to different drivers at different times, it all came into play and affected the race, I would say, in a positive way in this particular case. But a lot of the times it's not necessarily positive. But the fact is that, overtaking was possible in Brazil because there were drivers on new tyres against cars on old tyres. And you need that differential for overtaking to happen, because the cars are quite close on performance generally. And if they're on similar tyres, it's almost impossible for the drivers to actually pass one another. It's a bit of a shame.
It's
Anyway.
really nice that you've brought it back to the modern time, because my simple question was, who's your bet on winning this year's title? This was a question that was planned a bit earlier. Now I think it's a bit more obvious. And just, very quickly, what have you thought about the McLaren dynamic of the two drivers? Because you were there in 2007. People have made some similes.
Yeah.
Go into that, but yeah.
I think the McLaren is probably the best car right now, and I think it's been pretty clear that Lando has got the best out of it for the last two races. He seems to have stepped up a gear in terms of his mental approach, and I think that's given him an advantage over Oscar. Bear in mind, Oscar Piastri he's a younger driver. He hasn't had as much experience. So I think that might be a factor. I think Oscar has room to grow, whereas Lando is probably around the peak of his performance right now. So Oscar in 2 or 3 years' time is probably going to be a match, or potentially better than the Lando Norris that we have now. But it's a fact that Lando is outperforming Oscar at the moment for whatever reason. I think the data, the GPS data particularly, that all the teams have to, or is available to all the teams, and you can see what Max does in some areas, and he is the complete package. His time management is the best, and you can see that in Friday practice sessions when he's practicing it. He's spot on with what he does, and he does it all the time. He does everything. He does pretty much everything right all the time, and others approach his level of capability, but no one is as good as he is on as a consistent basis. And on top of that, he can clearly, he has been tuned into the Red Bull car more of the time, although they have had problems this year, and there have been times when that car clearly isn't behaving as he would wish it to, and that has cost his performance significantly. Brazil in qualifying, he was very, very unhappy, and even though he's as good as he is, he couldn't get a decent time out of that car. So it shows how important it is for the driver and car to be in tune with each other. I know he said that if he was in a McLaren, he would easily beat the other two drivers. Well, I don't know that that's true, because it may be that the McLaren behaves in a way that isn't in tune with his capability, but I suspect he would be able to adapt in the right given time, and it might not be much time that you would need to do that. But it's not as easy as I'm sure he said that as a wind up to the others anyway. And Charles Leclerc, he's the other driver. I think he was doing a phenomenal job with a car that is clearly substandard, for whatever reason. But again, he's had the benefit of a few years in a Ferrari, whereas Lewis has come in from Mercedes, a car that probably behaves in a different way, in an environment that is different, and he's clearly struggling with that. I think Lewis is a fantastic driver. In terms of the drivers in the garage at any one time, Lewis is the best was certainly up with the best, if not the best. I mean, the stuff he did in 2007, 2008 was mind-boggling how good he was in that car. Yes, it's a long time on since then, but he's still a very, very, very capable driver. And I don't, I think he could win a world championship in the right circumstances. But it's just the way it is. So yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but basically, I think Lando Norris is in the strongest position to win a championship because he's the best. He's doing the best job of driving the best car at the moment. But if McLaren don't, if they look like they've almost confused themselves a few times with strategies and choices, and it wouldn't take much for them to open the door again to Max. But he's a long way behind in the points now, and I think with 3 races left, it's starting to look too tall an order. If he'd had better weekends in Mexico and Brazil, then obviously it would have been more likely. But Lando has really stamped his authority on it. And I enjoy seeing that. I just enjoy seeing people doing great jobs at great times, even if it's not the best thing for competitiveness overall.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said about excellent driving, isn't there? In itself, it's incredible to watch. Whether it was Michael at Ferrari, whether it was Kimi after he missed the pit lane entrance in Monaco and then did 35 laps and pulled out his incredible lead, and whether it's Max Verstappen in 23 or even the McLaren drivers and Max now, we totally agree with you on that. I think quick fire, final 3 questions, Mark. We're beyond grateful for your time today. So first question, what's the single greatest race you've ever engineered?
The one that I think I had the most influence in that was most satisfying was Hungary in 2005, which Kimi did win. The reason for that is that we had an engine failure, and I think we were the first retirement at the previous race, which meant that we had to go out first in qualifying in Hungary. And at that time, the Hungary track, the sand used to blow onto that track between sessions. And that meant that you were carrying a penalty of in excess of a second per lap by being the first car out on the track. It's still true that the first car out on the track, it has the worst track now in every session, and why cars go out early in sessions beats me, but a lot of the time anyway. But we didn't have any choice. And it was also the time when you had to put the fuel in the car to start the race. And it was one at a time qualifying. So one car went out and did a lap, and then the next car. So we had some difficult choices to make. Is we knew that we had to win every race to have any chance of winning the championship. So the question was, how do we do this? And of course, the strategy people took the pragmatic approach, shall we say, of we aren't going to qualify well because we have to be first out. We know that. And therefore, we should put a lot of fuel in the car to go deep into the race because we've got a fast car. So we're going to be held up by lots of people early in the race. And it's only when we make a pit stop and we're going to come on clear track that we're going to be able to show our performance. And that is the obvious solution to the problem. But it would have meant that we wouldn't have won the race. It's as simple as that. Because the leader, whoever would have been the leader, would have been too far up the road, and there's no way we could possibly have won that race. So I came at it from the opposite point of view. I said, right, I don't agree with that, because what we have to do is qualify in the top 4. You cannot win this race unless you're in the top 4. Knowing the amount of performance we're going to lose by being out, by starting first in qualifying, is we have to take out the amount of fuel that compensates for that performance loss to have any chance at all. But at the same time, we have to not have so little fuel in the car that we're hosed. And so I put that forwards, and the strategists were very unhappy with that proposal. But Kimi completely bought into it. He agreed completely that he just needed to be up at the front to have a chance. But we knew that still was unlikely to work. But it was the only thing we did. I was confident that our car was going to be massively quicker. Well, Kimi and the car was going to be massively quicker than everybody else, because that's where we had been in terms of form up until that point. Anyway, I think he qualified 5th rather than in the top 4, which was a little bit of a hit. But we knew that we had some chance if he could make a good start, and if one of the cars ahead of us was Juan Pablo Montoya, team orders would allow Kimi ahead of Juan Pablo because they'd already realised that there's no chance that Juan Pablo could win the championship. So I think he made a decent start and got up to 4th or 3rd. I think Juan Pablo did let him through. I think something else happened. Maybe Fernando had a problem or something. Anyway, it ended up that Michael was leading the race and we were 2nd. And it came to our pit stop. And the strategists were still saying, well, we haven't got a chance. We're not quicker than the Ferrari, which I thought we were. It's just that we were following the Ferrari, so we couldn't see our pace. But according to their numbers, we weren't quicker than the Ferrari. So we've got no chance. We should just optimize to finish 2nd, and I totally disagreed with that. And I said, okay, no, we should put in. Well, the obvious solution was to try and short fill the car and try and jump Michael at the pit stops, on the basis that if he was sensible, he would put a large amount of fuel in his car. That was the suggestion, but I was completely opposed to that because that would guarantee us finishing 2nd. So I said, no, we should put a longer fuel middle stint in the car and see if we can find a way by. So that's what we did. Then the most remarkable thing happened. Ferrari short-filled Michael, which they absolutely should not have done. And that meant that although Michael was still in front, he was hosed from that point onwards. When it came to the 2nd stop, Michael stopped before we did. And Kimi was able to put in the laps that I knew he was capable of before his pit stop, and he came out in front, and the race was won. And that was it. And it was just the best feeling ever. Yeah.
I want to add just 3 things before Peter jumps in, Mark, and that was incredible. First thing, I think Kimi did qualify 4th. Your initial memory was correct. You can't win that race if you're not in the top 5. But the other 2 things I wanted to point out was I actually thought that too at the time, that Michael could have, if, as you just said, if he hadn't short fuel and he had just come out in front of Kimi in that final stint, there's a good chance Michael would have won that. So absolutely. The fact that you could see that is incredible. I mean, that is really like a race deciding move in a way. I mean, you could say you kind of won the race for them in that sense. But the other thing I remember about that weekend was that, it's the only time I've seen Kimi celebrate a win before he crossed the finish line. He literally put his hand up in the final corner. And that's just, when you watch a driver for so long, he never does that. He's such a reserved guy in that sense. He's stoic almost. And that just, I think he knew the magnitude of what had just happened. And it felt like the championship was alive again because Alonso had retired, as you alluded to earlier. Yeah. So that was an incredible weekend, wasn't it? I mean, it was.
Yeah. And he actually came on the radio and said, "Oh, I'd like Mark to come up on the podium."
Wow.
Which wasn't something that happened very much back in those days. And Ron said no.
Okay, well,
which was fine because Ron was the face of McLaren, and he had every right to stand up there and accept the constructors' trophy. But I was just, it pleased me immensely that Kimi just said that, because it showed to me how much he realised that I had fought for his corner, and that meant an awful lot, really. And I was just very, very proud of making the right calls on that day. And it's crazy, that's one race out of God knows how many. But yeah, I just remember that race with immense satisfaction because I do think I played a part in winning that race a bit more than maybe would normally have been the case. And yeah, it was just a fantastic feeling.
What a story. It's incredible, Mark. That is incredible. Peter, did you want to jump in for the final 2?
So final 2 questions from me. First one, is there one driver that you never worked with that you wish you could have?
That's a really difficult question, because you don't know what their personalities are, and personality is such an important part of the relationship. When Kimi joined McLaren, I had no idea what he was going to be like. And I remember when he first came to the factory, he came in to see the sort of mock-up car, which was in the car build area, and he was wearing this long black leather coat, and he had a his very short white hair, bleached, or it looked like bleach, but I don't think it was. And he looked like something out of Star Wars, or he looked like he looked quite alien in a way, and I was quite intimidated by his appearance, even though he was a 22-year-old kid. But fortunately, we found very quickly that he's actually just a very normal human being and easy to get on with. Well, no, not a normal human being, but a very pleasant person to get on with. So all I can say is, I think you want to work with the best people in any era because they're inspirational people. So I would always choose people like Jim Clark, Jackie Stewart, Niki Lauda, Mario Andretti, actually, because I love American racing and his background, where he came up through dirt car racing, and he brought new ideas into Formula 1 in terms of setup. And then Alain Prost. I mean, I actually had the unbelievable opportunity to run Alain when he tested for McLaren in 95 and 96. He was actually the very first driver I ran at a circuit. We did a test at Paul Ricard, and it was just unbelievable to work with someone like him, an absolute legend and the nicest person you would ever meet. That was the thing that completely blew me away. I remember sitting in the motorhome at Silverstone, a wet test day at Silverstone when we couldn't run because of the track conditions, and we were talking about French politics, and there was some post office workers' strikes going on, and we were chatting about that. He's just the nicest, most humble guy, but also a very clever, capable person. So it would have been great to work with him. I mean, Ayrton Senna obviously stands out. And nowadays, I guess it would have been great to work with Max or Sebastian Vettel. Got on very well with Kimi, so I assume he's someone I might have got on with. I did speak to him a couple of times just in passing, and he seemed like a very nice bloke. I had the pleasure of meeting Carlos Reutemann at an Autosports Awards dinner, and a very intimidating character, but other people speak of him very highly. So I don't know. There isn't anyone in particular. I just really admire people who are good at what they do. And when you get the opportunity to work with the best people, it brings more to your performance as well. So that's all I could say really. It is an utter privilege to work with really, really good people.
And final question. Obviously, last year you retired from Formula One. If any opportunities came your way to return to the paddock, would you take them, or has that ship sailed for you?
You shouldn't say never, I suppose, but the fact of the matter is that the number of races that are done these days, it really does have a big impact on you through the season. And then there are lots of other stresses and demands on people. I just have a huge amount of respect for the people who are able to continue doing it in the current environment. I found that it was taking away the enjoyment that I'd had from the sport. It wasn't feeling the same anymore. So I find it difficult to foresee that there would be a role that I'd be happy to do. It couldn't be as an every weekend thing, I don't think. So I think I've had a pretty good run. I think I cannot believe. I honestly have to pinch myself when I look back on it. It's almost like it was a different person that got to do the things I did. I'm amazed, absolutely amazed that I got the opportunities I did, and feel so lucky that people allowed me to do the things, that give me the opportunity to do the things I did. So it's been fantastic, but I think it's fair to say that time has come to put it to one side and just be happy that I got the chance to do what I did. So I don't foresee me going back anymore.
And Mark, we would like to say that it's truly incredible and amazing to have you on here discussing these experiences with us. So
it's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for taking the time. This was simply incredible. Like I mentioned, this means the world to us, and we would obviously love to bring you back in the future, and you are certainly welcome back anytime. We'll send over the Zoom file, the transcript, and our eternal gratitude to you, of course, after this call. And we wish you all the best with your endeavors, and we look forward to staying in touch. So thank you again, Mark.
Well, I just wanted to say that I do love the sport, always have done. It's why I got involved in it in the first place, and I was very lucky to do so. But it's always a pleasure to talk about it with people who have a genuine affection for it as well, and understand how the business works, and see it for real, because there's quite a lot of noise about things a lot of the time, and I think that can detract from it. So to speak to genuine enthusiasts and people who understand how it works and have a real connection with it, it's always a pleasure. So absolutely, I loved it. I can talk forever.
It's a pleasure to have a legend like you on the podcast. Yeah. And you've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. We're on YouTube and Spotify at DRS Train Podcast. If you become a channel member, you can get access to bonus content and behind-the-scenes clips. You'll join our current members, Blue Guy, Burak Choshkun, Chris O'Dea, Elizabeth Hearn, and Gittel Bedell. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks very much.
On Earth.